Welcome to Summarize This. Today we're exploring one of the most influential works ever written on politics, power, and war, the history of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. Written in the late 5th century BCE, this masterpiece chronicles the devastating 27-year conflict between Athens and Sparta that tore the Greek world apart and marked the end of Athens' golden age. But Thucydides created far more than a war chronicle. He invented a new kind of history, rigorous, analytical, and secular, that examines the permanent patterns of political behavior. Where earlier historians like Herodotus mixed fact with legend and divine intervention, Thucydides eliminated the gods and focused exclusively on human decisions, human psychology, and political dynamics. His work is the first truly scientific history. Thucydides was uniquely positioned to write this history. He was an Athenian general who fought in the war, was exiled from military failure, and spent 20 years traveling, interviewing participants on both sides, and analyzing what he witnessed. He declared his purpose explicitly, to create a possession for all time, a work of permanent value because it reveals how human nature operates in politics and war. The circumstances change, but the fundamental patterns repeat. The history covers the years from 431 to 411 BCE, breaking off incomplete 7 years before the war's end. Across 8 books, Thucydides examines how fear and ambition drive great powers into conflict, how democracy functions under extreme stress, how war erodes moral constraints, how empires overreach and collapse, and how the quest for security produces the very disasters nations seek to avoid. His analysis is brutally honest, showing Athens and Sparta both at their best and worst, giving voice to all sides without sentimentality or propaganda. This work has shaped political and strategic thinking for over 2,000 years. Generals study it to understand warfare. Statesmen read it to grasp power dynamics. International relations scholars cite the Thucydides trap, the dangerous situation when a rising power threatens an established one. The great speeches Thucydides includes Pericles' funeral oration, the Mytilenean debate, the Melian dialogue remain touchstones for debates about democracy, justice, and power. In this comprehensive summary, we'll work through all 8 books, plus Thucydides' enduring legacy. We'll trace the war from its origins through escalation, catastrophic mistakes, moral collapse, and Athens' near destruction. We'll encounter his penetrating insights on human nature, his analysis of why wars spiral beyond anyone's intentions, his unflinching examination of how power corrupts, and his profound meditation on the tragic dimension of political life. Whether you're interested in military history, political philosophy, international relations, or simply want to understand one of the foundational texts of Western thought, this summary will give you thorough comprehension of why Thucydides remains essential reading for anyone thinking seriously about politics and power. Let's begin. In the history of Western thought, few works have shaped our understanding of politics, power, and human nature as profoundly as Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War. Written over 2,000 years ago, this account of a brutal 27-year conflict between Athens and Sparta remains startlingly relevant. Political scientists, military strategists, and statesmen still study Thucydides to understand the dynamics of great power competition, the nature of democracy under stress, and the tragic patterns that repeat throughout human history. This is not merely ancient history, but a profound meditation on the permanent features of political life. Thucydides was born around 460 BCE into a wealthy and prominent Athenian family. His father was Olorus, a name suggesting connections to Thracian aristocracy, and Thucydides himself owned gold mining rights in Thrace, giving him considerable wealth and influence. He lived through Athens' greatest period of power and cultural achievement under Pericles, when the city was the leading force in the Greek world, a vibrant democracy, and the center of art, philosophy, and drama. He witnessed the construction of the Parthenon, heard the tragedies of Sophocles and Euripides performed, and lived in the same city as Socrates. This was Athens at its zenith, confident in its power and proud of its democratic institutions. But Thucydides also witnessed Athens' decline and the catastrophic war that destroyed its empire. In 431 BCE, when war broke out between Athens and Sparta, Thucydides was about 30 years old. He tells us that he began writing his history from the very beginning of the conflict, recognizing immediately that this would be the greatest war the Greeks had ever fought. This is a remarkable claim and shows Thucydides' historical insight. While others might have seen just another conflict in the endless struggles between Greek city-states, Thucydides understood that something unprecedented was unfolding. He was right. The Peloponnesian War would drag on for 27 years, involve virtually every Greek state, draw in the Persian Empire, transform Greek politics and society, and ultimately exhaust the Greek city-states, leaving them vulnerable to eventual Macedonian conquest. Thucydides was not merely an observer of these events. In 424 BCE, he was elected as one of Athens' 10 generals and given command of a fleet in the northern Aegean. His task was to protect the strategically important city of Amphipolis from Spartan attack. When the brilliant Spartan commander Brasidas moved against Amphipolis, Thucydides was unable to arrive in time to prevent the city's fall. This failure had severe consequences. The Athenian assembly, always quick to blame commanders for defeats, exiled Thucydides for 20 years. This exile, personally devastating, proved historically fortunate. Removed from active politics and military command, Thucydides could travel freely, interview participants on both sides of the conflict, and dedicate himself to writing history. He spent these 20 years researching, analyzing, and composing his work. His exile gave him both the time and the perspective necessary to create something far more profound than a simple chronicle of events. What makes Thucydides revolutionary is his approach to history itself. Before Thucydides, Greek historical writing took the form of Herodotus's histories, a sweeping narrative mixing factual accounts with legends, divine intervention, and entertaining digressions. Herodotus was a brilliant storyteller, but his history included gods affecting battles, oracles predicting the future, and wonderful tales that may or may not have been true. Thucydides breaks completely with this tradition. He eliminates the gods from his account. Events happen because of human decisions, human psychology, and political dynamics, not because Zeus favors one side or Apollo sends a plague. This is a stunning intellectual achievement, secularizing historical explanation in a deeply religious culture. Thucydides also establishes rigorous standards for evidence and truth. In his introduction, he explains his method. For the events of the war, he relied on his own observations where possible, and on eyewitness testimony where he couldn't observe directly. He cross-examined witnesses, compared accounts, and tried to determine what actually happened rather than what people wanted to believe happened. Thucydides acknowledges this is difficult work. People's memories are unreliable, they have biases, they want their own side to look good, and they often confuse what they heard with what they saw. Thucydides understands all these problems and tries to work through them to reach historical truth. This critical, evidence-based approach makes him arguably the first scientific historian. Most remarkably, Thucydides states his purpose clearly. He's not writing to entertain audiences at public festivals, which was Herodotus's context. He's writing for readers who want to understand political and military affairs clearly. He's creating what he calls a possession for all time, a work of permanent value because it analyzes patterns in human behavior that will recur. Thucydides believes human nature is constant. The circumstances of politics change, but the fundamental dynamics of fear, honor, and interest remain the same. Therefore, by understanding how Athens and Sparta fell into war, how democracies behave under stress, how power corrupts, and how wars escalate beyond anyone's initial intentions, readers can understand their own political situations better. This is an astonishingly modern conception of history as a guide to understanding permanent features of political life, rather than a collection of entertaining stories or a celebration of one's own city. The conflict Thucydides analyzes emerged from the structure of power in the Greek world after the Persian Wars. In 480 to 479 BCE, the Greeks had achieved miraculous victories against the massive Persian invasion, with Athens playing the leading role, especially in the naval victory at Salamis. After the Persians retreated, Athens organized the Delian League, an alliance of Greek city-states ostensibly formed to continue the war against Persia and liberate Greek cities still under Persian control. Athens led this alliance and provided the largest naval forces. Other cities contributed either ships or money. Over time, the Delian League transformed from a voluntary alliance into an Athenian empire. Cities that tried to leave the alliance were forced back in by Athenian military power. The League's treasury moved from the island of Delos to Athens itself. Tribute money that was supposed to fund common defense was used to build Athens' magnificent temples and public buildings. Allied cities became subject, ruled by Athens, and required to use Athenian coinage, follow Athenian legal procedures in certain cases, and accept Athenian garrisons and officials. This Athenian empire created wealth, power, and confidence in Athens, but also fear and resentment among other Greeks. Sparta, the other great Greek power, led the Peloponnesian League, an alliance of states that maintained more autonomy than Athens' subjects. Sparta's system was very different from Athens. Where Athens was a radical democracy with all citizens participating in government, Sparta was a militaristic oligarchy ruled by a small elite. Where Athens was a maritime commercial power, Sparta was a land-based agricultural state. Where Athens was culturally dynamic and innovative, Sparta was conservative and traditional. These two powers represented fundamentally different visions of how Greeks should live and be governed. Thucydides identifies what he calls the truest cause of the war, though it was least openly acknowledged. The growth of Athenian power and the fear this caused in Sparta made war inevitable. This is one of Thucydides' most famous and debated claims. He distinguishes between the immediate causes of the war, the specific disputes and incidents that triggered the fighting, and the underlying structural cause, the destabilizing shift in the balance of power. A rising power and an established power locked into competition create dynamics that make war extremely likely, even if neither side necessarily wants war initially. This insight has been so influential that contemporary international relations scholars refer to the Thucydides trap, the dangerous situation when a rising power threatens to displace an established power. The structure of Thucydides' work reflects his analytical purposes. The history is divided into 8 books, though Thucydides didn't complete it. The narrative breaks off abruptly in 411 BCE, 7 years before the war's end. We don't know why. Perhaps Thucydides died before finishing. Perhaps he planned further books that were lost. The work as we have it covers the period from 431 to 411 BCE, roughly the first 20 years of the 27-year war. Within this time frame, Thucydides organizes his account year by year, typically dividing each year into a summer campaign season and a winter. This analytic structure provides chronological clarity and allows readers to follow the war's unfolding. But Thucydides also employs a brilliant literary technique that makes his history philosophically profound. Throughout the work, he includes speeches delivered by political leaders, generals, and ambassadors at crucial moments. These speeches are unlike anything in earlier historical writing. Thucydides tells us explicitly that he couldn't remember exactly what was said in most cases, and even when he was present, he couldn't recall speeches word for word. Therefore, he composed speeches that captured what he thought the speaker would have said or should have said given the situation, while adhering as closely as possible to the general sense of what was actually said. This technique has troubled some modern historians who want verbatim accuracy. But Thucydides' purpose is not courtroom transcription. The speeches articulate the underlying logic of different positions, making explicit the reasoning that motivated decisions and actions. They're analytical tools that help readers understand why people acted as they did. These speeches also explore fundamental questions about justice, power, democracy, and human nature. The most famous speeches, which we'll examine in detail as we proceed, include Pericles' funeral oration praising Athenian democracy, the Mytilenean debate about how Athens should treat rebellious allies, and the Melian dialogue exploring whether might makes right in relations between states. These set pieces have influenced political thought for over 2 millennia. They're not decorative additions, but essential elements of Thucydides' analysis. The history of the Peloponnesian War gives us something unique in ancient literature, a rigorously analytical account of politics and war written by someone who was both participant and scholar, insider and outsider, general and exile. Thucydides understood power from experience, but analyzed it with philosophical depth. He loved Athens, but refused to prettify its actions or ignore its mistakes. He admired certain Spartans while recognizing Sparta's deep flaws. He gave voice to all sides, allowing Democrats and oligarchs, Athenians and Spartans, imperialists and victims to make their cases. This even-handedness, combined with penetrating analysis, makes his work enduringly valuable. As we work through the 8 books of Thucydides' history, we'll follow the war's unfolding from its origins through Athens' catastrophic Sicilian expedition to the oligarchic revolution that nearly destroyed Athenian democracy. We'll examine the great speeches that illuminate the deepest questions about justice and power. We'll watch as war transforms societies, corrupts morals, and destroys the very things people fight to preserve. We'll see how democracies behave under stress, how empires overreach, how fear drives escalation, and how human nature asserts itself when civilized constraints break down. And we'll understand why this ancient Greek conflict speaks so powerfully to our own times. When great powers compete, democracies face internal and external threats, and the questions Thucydides asked remain as urgent as ever. The history of the Peloponnesian War is not just about a war that happened long ago. It's about the permanent features of political life that every generation must grapple with. Let's begin our journey through this monumental work. Book 1 of Thucydides' history establishes both his methodological foundations and his analysis of how the Peloponnesian War began. The book divides into several distinct sections, each revealing different aspects of Thucydides' historical method and political insight. It opens with what scholars call the archaeology, moves through the immediate causes of war involving Epidamnus, Corcyra, and Potidaea, presents the crucial speeches at Sparta where war was debated and decided, and concludes with the Pentacontiaea, a retrospective account of how Athenian power grew in the 50 years between the Persian and Peloponnesian Wars. The archaeology is Thucydides' sketch of Greek history from earliest times to his own era. This might seem an odd way to begin a war history, but it serves crucial purposes. Thucydides wants to demonstrate that the Peloponnesian War was indeed the greatest conflict Greeks had ever fought, surpassing even the legendary Trojan War. To make this case, he must show what earlier Greek history was actually like, stripping away mythological exaggeration. The archaeology thus demonstrates Thucydides' rationalistic method applied to the distant past where evidence is scarce and unreliable. Thucydides argues that early Greece was weak, impoverished, and divided. There was no collected action or unified Hellenic identity. Different tribes lived in small, insecure communities, constantly migrating as stronger groups displaced weaker ones. Piracy was common, not shameful, but an accepted way of life. Cities had no walls because they lacked the wealth and organization to build them. The legendary expeditions against Troy and other targets were far smaller than epic poetry suggested. When Homer speaks of 1,000 ships sailing to Troy, Thucydides calculates realistically how many men each ship could carry and concludes the forces were modest. The Trojan War happened, but it was limited in scale and duration, not the massive 10-year siege of legend. What changed this primitive condition? Gradually, some communities accumulated wealth through agriculture and trade. This wealth enabled them to build fortifications, develop larger political structures, and project power beyond their immediate territories. The crucial development was sea power. The first Greek ruler to build a significant navy was Minos of Crete, who suppressed piracy and established control over the Aegean islands. Later, Corinth became a major naval power. Eventually, Athens built the largest fleet and transformed naval power into the foundation of empire. This progression from poverty and weakness to wealth and organization, from land-based to maritime power, from small scattered communities to large unified states, culminates in Athens and Sparta, the two greatest powers Greece had ever seen. Therefore, when these two powers went to war, each at the height of its strength, each able to mobilize massive resources, the conflict would necessarily surpass anything that came before. The archaeology establishes this claim through rational analysis of evidence rather than accepting traditional stories at face value. It also establishes key themes. Power matters. States with wealth and organization dominate those without. Maritime power is especially important because it enables long-range force projection and empire building, and states naturally seek to increase their power, creating inevitable conflicts as rising powers challenge established ones. Having established the war's significance, Thucydides turns to immediate causes, the specific disputes that triggered the conflict. Here, his analysis becomes more detailed and based on contemporary events he could investigate directly. The trouble begins in Epidamnus, a Greek colony on the coast of what is now Albania. Epidamnus was a colony of Corcyra, which was itself a colony of Corinth. Internal conflict erupted in Epidamnus between democratic and aristocratic factions. The Democrats won and expelled the aristocrats, who then hired barbarian tribesmen and besieged their own city. Desperate, the Epidamnian Democrats appealed to their mother city, Corcyra, for help. Corcyra refused, perhaps because they sympathized with the aristocrats or simply didn't want involvement. The Epidamnians then appealed to Corcyra's mother city, Corinth. Corinth saw an opportunity. Corcyra had long been hostile to Corinth despite their colonial relationship. Unlike most colonies, which maintained respectful ties to their founding cities, Corcyra treated Corinth with contempt, refusing to grant Corinthians the honors customary at public festivals. This resentment motivated Corinth to help Epidamnus as a way of striking back at Corcyra. Corinth sent military aid and settlers to reinforce Epidamnus. Corcyra, outraged at this interference, demanded that Epidamnus expel the Corinthians and restore the exiled aristocrats. When Epidamnus refused, Corcyra besieged it. Corinth prepared a larger expedition to relieve Epidamnus and punish Corcyra. In 435 BCE, the Corcyraean and Corinthian fleets met at the Battle of Lusimi, and Corcyra won decisively. Epidamnus surrendered to Corcyra. The Corinthians, humiliated, spent the next 2 years building a much larger fleet and preparing for a second round. This is where Athens becomes involved, transforming a local dispute into a step toward general war. Corcyra, facing the massive fleet Corinth was assembling, realized it needed help. Corcyra had deliberately remained neutral, belonging to neither the Athenian-led Delian League nor the Spartan-led Peloponnesian League. This neutrality had served them well, but now they needed allies. In 433 BCE, Corcyraean ambassadors came to Athens requesting a defensive alliance. They made a coldly realistic argument. Corcyra possessed the third largest navy in Greece after Athens and Corinth. If Corinth defeated Corcyra and captured its fleet, the naval balance of power would shift dramatically against Athens. Better for Athens to ally with Corcyra now, preserving Corcyraean naval power and preventing Corinth from gaining it. War between Athens and the Peloponnesians was coming anyway, the Corcyraeans argued. Athens should position itself advantageously. Corinth sent ambassadors to Athens as well, arguing that Athens should stay neutral. The 30-year peace treaty between Athens and Sparta, signed in 446 to 445 BCE, allowed neutral cities to join either alliance, but prohibited members from switching sides or interfering with each other's allies. If Athens allied with Corcyra, Corinth argued, this would violate the treaty, since it would interfere with Corinth's effort to discipline a rebellious colony. The Athenians were divided. Some wanted to stay out of the dispute. Others, led by Pericles, saw strategic value in the Corcyraean alliance. The Athenian assembly compromised, agreeing to a defensive alliance with Corcyra. Athens would help defend Corcyra if directly attacked, but wouldn't join offensive operations against Corinth. This distinction between defensive and offensive operations would prove impossible to maintain in practice. In 433 BCE, the Corinthian and Corcyraean fleets met near the Sabota Islands in one of the largest naval battles Greeks had yet fought. Athens sent 10 ships to observe and intervene only if Corcyra was about to be completely destroyed. The battle was fought in an old-fashioned style, with heavily armed infantry on the ships attempting to board and fight hand-to-hand rather than employing ramming tactics. Initially, the Corinthians had the upper hand and sank many Corcyraean ships. When it appeared Corcyra might be overwhelmed, the Athenian ships joined the fighting. The Corinthians, seeing Athenian intervention and spotting additional Athenian reinforcements approaching, withdrew. Both sides claimed victory. Corcyra survived and maintained its fleet. Corinth had demonstrated military superiority but failed to destroy Corcyra or capture its ships. Athens was now entangled in conflict with Corinth, a major Spartan ally.
The next crisis involved Potidaea, a city on the Chalcidice Peninsula in northern Greece. Potidaea was originally a Corinthian colony, but had been incorporated into the Athenian Empire and paid tribute to Athens. However, Potidaea maintained traditional ties to Corinth, including annually receiving Corinthian magistrates who held official positions in the city. After the confrontation at Sabota, Athens feared that Corinth would encourage Potidaea and other Chalcidian cities to revolt. The Athenians demanded that Potidaea expel the Corinthian magistrates, tear down part of its defensive walls, and send hostages to Athens. These were harsh demands, essentially requiring Potidaea to sever ties with Corinth and submit completely to Athenian control. The Potidaeans were caught between two great powers. They sent ambassadors to Athens trying to negotiate softer terms, while simultaneously sending ambassadors to Sparta, seeking assurances of support if they revolted. The Spartans secretly promised that if Potidaea revolted and Athens attacked, Sparta would invade Attica to draw Athenian forces away. Emboldened by this promise, Potidaea refused Athens' demands and revolted in 432 BCE, along with several other Chalcidian cities. The Athenians sent a substantial force to suppress the revolt. The Corinthians, unable to watch their colony besieged, sent troops to help Potidaea, though officially these were volunteers, not a state expedition, to avoid openly breaking the peace treaty. In 432 BCE, outside the walls of Potidaea, Athenian and Corinthian forces fought a battle. Athens won, but both sides suffered significant casualties. The Athenians settled down to besiege Potidaea, a siege that would drag on for years and drain Athens' treasury.
These events brought the crisis to Sparta. Corinth was furious. From their perspective, Athens had repeatedly violated the spirit, if not the letter, of the peace treaty by interfering with Corcyra, and now Athens was besieging a Corinthian colony and had killed Corinthian citizens. If Sparta did nothing, Corinth might conclude that the Peloponnesian League was worthless and seek other alliances, potentially even approaching Athens. In 432 BCE, the Corinthians summoned the Peloponnesian League allies to Sparta and demanded action. Thucydides presents this meeting through 4 speeches that are among the most famous in the history. First, the Corinthians address the Spartan assembly. Their speech is remarkable for its psychological acuity. The Corinthians diagnose what they see as Sparta's fatal weakness, not military inferiority, but a conservative mindset that prevents them from recognizing danger until too late. The Corinthians contrast Athenian and Spartan national characters through a series of brilliant antitheses. The Athenians are innovative, quick to form plans and quick to execute them, always taking the initiative. The Spartans are conservative, slow to act, always preferring to wait. The Athenians are bold, willing to run risks and try new methods. The Spartans are cautious, trusting only proven approaches. The Athenians are restless, always active, traveling widely, creating opportunities. The Spartans are stay-at-homes, reluctant to leave their territory even when necessary. The Athenians are energetic, spending their lives in constant toil for their city. The Spartans are leisurely, enjoying their stable way of life.
In normal times, the Corinthians suggest Spartan conservatism serves well, but these are not normal times. Athens is an expansionist imperial power that will not stop growing until it dominates all Greece. Sparta's moderation and delay, virtues in peacetime, become catastrophic in the face of relentless Athenian ambition. The Corinthians remind the Spartans that the Persians, coming from the ends of the earth, almost conquered Greece because Sparta moved too slowly to organize effective resistance. Athens is far closer and far more dangerous than Persia ever was. Yet Sparta does nothing while Athens grows stronger every day. The Corinthians deliver an ultimatum. If Sparta doesn't lead the Peloponnesian League against Athens now, Corinth and other allies will seek protection elsewhere. An Athenian delegation happened to be in Sparta on other business when the meeting was convened. Thucydides depicts them requesting permission to address the assembly, not to defend themselves against specific charges which they dismiss, but to present a broader argument for why Sparta should prefer peace. The Athenian speech is unapologetic and brutally frank about power. Yes, Athens has an empire. The empire was not acquired by force, but was voluntarily given to Athens after the Persian Wars, when allies needed Athens' naval power for protection. Once established, the empire proved impossible to give up. Athens maintains the empire now from motives that are neither noble nor shameful, but simply natural: fear, honor, and self-interest. Fear that if Athens gave up the empire, it would be vulnerable to its enemies. Honor that maintains Athens' reputation and prestige. Self-interest that the empire benefits Athens materially. These are the three universal motives that govern all states' behavior.
The Athenians argue that they actually rule their empire more justly than they need to. Given their overwhelming power, they could treat subjects far more harshly. Instead, Athens maintains legal processes that give subjects some voice and protection. The Spartans should remember that if they had maintained leadership after the Persian Wars, they would face the same imperatives and behave similarly. Any great power would. The Athenians then issue a warning. War is unpredictable. Both sides expect easy victory, but wars rarely go as planned. Once begun, war develops its own momentum, escalating beyond anyone's initial intentions. Sparta should think carefully before starting a war whose outcome and consequences no one can foresee. Next, King Archidamus, one of Sparta's two hereditary kings, addresses the assembly, urging caution. Archidamus is old, experienced, and wise. He acknowledges Athens' provocations, but argues that war requires careful preparation. Athens has advantages Sparta lacks: a large fleet, significant financial reserves, and a strategy of avoiding land battles behind their walls while using naval power to strike Sparta's allies. Sparta's strength lies in its army, but armies require money to maintain in the field, and the Peloponnesian League's finances are limited. Spartan soldiers are mainly farmers who can't campaign indefinitely without ruining their farms. Archidamus proposes that Sparta should send embassies to Athens, demanding that they cease their aggressive actions. If Athens refuses, Sparta should spend time building up financial resources and securing allies before going to war. There's no shame in delay if it leads to victory. Rashness is more dangerous than caution. Finally, the ephors Thenelaidas speaks. Ephors were 5 magistrates elected annually from all Spartan citizens, wielding enormous power in Sparta's mixed constitution. Sthenelaidas delivers a short, blunt, emotional speech completely different from the sophisticated arguments that preceded it. He dismisses the Athenian claims about justice and the Corinthian analysis of national character. The issue is simple. Athens has wronged Sparta's allies. Treaties have been violated. Spartan honor requires action. Sthenelaidas condemns the habit of endless deliberation while enemies grow stronger. The time for talk is over. The time for action is now. The Spartans should vote for war. Sthenelaidas calls for a vote. Spartan assemblies voted by acclamation, shouting rather than formal counting. Stenalidas claims he can't distinguish which side is louder and calls for a division, having those who think Athens has violated the treaty and war is justified stand on one side, those who disagree on the other. The vast majority stand for war. Thucydides notes this was not because they were convinced by argument, but because they feared Athenian power was growing too great and might soon threaten Sparta directly. This vote was technically only to declare that Athens had violated the treaty. The Peloponnesian League required approval from the majority of member states before actually declaring war. About a month later, representatives from all allied states met in Sparta. The Corinthians delivered another speech urging united action. This time, the allies voted overwhelmingly for war. However, Sparta didn't immediately invade. The Spartans sent several embassies to Athens over the following months, making various demands: expel the Alcmeonidae, a cursed family, reverse the Megarian decree that excluded Megara from Athenian markets and ports, grant autonomy to the cities of the Athenian Empire. These demands were calculated to be unacceptable, generating the best possible justification for war. Athens, led by Pericles, refused all demands. War became inevitable. But before narrating the war's outbreak, Thucydides inserts the Pentacontaidia, literally the 50 years, his account of the period from 479 to 431 BCE. This section describes how Athens transformed from one Greek state among many to an imperial power that threatened Sparta's position. After the Persian Wars, Athens led the Delian League, nominally to continue fighting Persia and liberate Greek cities under Persian control. Athens contributed the most ships and commanded the Allied fleet. Gradually, most allies stopped providing ships and instead paid tribute in money. This gave Athens complete control of the League's naval power, while allies became increasingly dependent. When cities tried to leave the League, Athens forced them back in militarily and installed democratic governments loyal to Athens. The League's treasury moved from Delos to Athens. By the 440s, the Delian League had become an Athenian empire in all but name, with Athens using tribute to fund massive building projects in Athens itself. This growth of Athenian power alarmed Sparta and triggered conflicts. In the 450s, Athens and Sparta fought an inconclusive First Peloponnesian War that ended with the 30 Years' Peace in 446–445 BCE. This treaty created a balance of power framework. Athens and Sparta each recognized the other's alliance system. Neutral cities could join either alliance freely. Neither side would interfere with the other's allies. Both sides would submit disputes to binding arbitration. The treaty aimed at freezing the status quo and preventing further Athenian expansion. For 15 years, the peace held, but it couldn't resolve the underlying structural problem that Thucydides identifies as the truest cause of war: the growth of Athenian power and the fear this inspired in Sparta. This is Thucydides' most famous analytical claim and has been endlessly debated. He distinguishes between immediate causes, the specific disputes over Epidamnus, Corcyra, and Potidaea, and the underlying cause that made war inevitable. The immediate causes were real grievances that triggered the war in 431 BCE, but even without these specific disputes, war would likely have come eventually because of the structural dynamic between a rising power and an established power. Athens in the 430s was still growing, expanding its navy, increasing its wealth, extending its influence. Sparta saw this growth as ultimately threatening its own security and position as Greece's leading land power. Fear of what Athens might become drove Sparta to war while it still had a chance of winning, rather than waiting until Athens became completely dominant. This analysis has profound implications. It suggests that wars often result not primarily from specific grievances or even from aggressive intentions, but from structural features of the international system. When power shifts rapidly, when a rising state threatens to overtake an established power, war becomes likely even if neither side necessarily wants it. Both sides face security dilemmas. The rising power fears that if it doesn't continue growing, it will be vulnerable. The established power fears that if it doesn't act now, the rising power will become unbeatable. These dynamics can make war seem inevitable, or at least extremely difficult to avoid through diplomacy.
Book 1 thus establishes both Thucydides' historical method and his central analytical framework. His method combines rational criticism of sources, attention to multiple perspectives through speeches, and systematic investigation of both immediate events and underlying causes. His framework emphasizes structural factors, especially the dynamics of power and fear, while recognizing that decisions made by specific individuals and states matter enormously for how conflicts unfold. The book leaves the reader with a sense of tragic inevitability. Once Athenian power began growing and Spartan fear began intensifying, forces were set in motion that would be extremely difficult to stop. Yet the war was not predetermined in some fatalistic sense. Different decisions at crucial moments might have prevented it or changed its character. The tension between structural forces and human agency, between inevitability and contingency, runs throughout the history and makes it philosophically profound rather than just a chronicle of events.
Book 2 begins the actual narrative of the war, year by year, summer by summer, and winter by winter. It contains two of the most famous and powerful passages in all of Greek literature: Pericles' funeral oration celebrating Athenian democracy, and Thucydides' harrowing description of the plague that devastated Athens. The juxtaposition of these two passages creates one of the most dramatic ironies in the history. Pericles presents an idealized vision of Athens at its height, and immediately afterward, that vision is shattered by catastrophe. The war began in spring 431 BCE, with a Peloponnesian invasion of Attica led by the Spartan king Archidamus. This would become the pattern for most of the war's first phase. Nearly every summer, Spartan and allied forces marched into Athenian territory, cutting down crops, burning buildings, destroying orchards and vineyards. The Spartans hoped this devastation would force Athens to come out and fight a decisive land battle where Sparta's superior infantry would crush them. Pericles, however, had a different strategy. He refused to let the Athenian army meet the Peloponnesians in open battle. Instead, the entire rural population of Attica evacuated into Athens and the port of Piraeus, abandoning their farms and homes to destruction. Athens was protected by the long walls, fortifications connecting the city to its port 5 miles away, creating a secure corridor. As long as Athens controlled the sea, it could be supplied by ship even while under siege. The strategy was to avoid land battles, use Athens' superior navy to raid Peloponnesian coasts, and wait for the enemy to exhaust itself and run out of money to keep armies in the field.
This strategy was psychologically devastating for Athenians. Farmers watched from the walls as the Spartans burned their farms, destroyed generations of labor, cut down the olive trees that took decades to mature. It violated every Greek military tradition that demanded defending one's land. But Pericles argued it was rational. Land and buildings could be replaced. Lives and military power could not. If Athens met Sparta on land and lost, the war would be over. If Athens stayed safe behind its walls, maintained naval superiority, and conserved its resources, it would ultimately prevail through Sparta's exhaustion. This required discipline and trust in Pericles' leadership, both of which the Athenians initially maintained despite the hardship. At the end of the first year of war, following Athenian custom, Athens held a public funeral for all citizens who had died in battle. 10 cypress coffins were carried in procession, one for each of Athens' 10 tribes, plus an empty bier for the missing whose bodies couldn't be recovered. The remains were buried in the public cemetery in the beautiful suburb of Keramicus, and a prominent citizen chosen by the state delivered a funeral oration. Pericles was selected for this honor. What he delivered, according to Thucydides, was not just a eulogy for the dead, but a comprehensive celebration of Athenian democracy, culture, and way of life. The funeral oration is structured brilliantly. Pericles begins by acknowledging the difficulty of the task.
How can any speaker do justice to brave men who died for their city? Words inevitably fall short of deeds. Those who knew the dead well will think the speaker hasn't praised them enough. Those who didn't know them may suspect exaggeration. But the custom must be observed. Pericles then makes a remarkable decision. Rather than recounting the military achievements of Athens' past, as was traditional in funeral orations, he will focus instead on the city itself, on its constitution, its character, and its way of life. By praising Athens, he praises those who died for it. The dead are worthy because Athens is worthy. Pericles describes Athenian democracy with eloquent pride. Athens' constitution is called democracy because power rests with the many, not the few. Laws provide equal justice to all citizens in private disputes. In public life, what matters is merit, not birth or wealth. If a citizen has ability to serve the state, poverty doesn't prevent him from doing so. Athenians live freely, both in public affairs and in private life. The city doesn't intrude into citizens' private choices. People live as they please, without neighbors spying and disapproving. Yet this freedom doesn't produce chaos, because Athenians obey the laws, especially the unwritten laws, whose violation brings shame.
Pericles contrasts Athens with Sparta without naming it. Where Sparta's rigorous military education trains boys from childhood in harsh discipline, Athens allows citizens to live at ease, cultivating the mind and soul. Yet Athenians are equally brave in battle. Where Sparta is closed and secretive, expelling foreigners and hiding military knowledge, Athens is open to the world, welcoming foreigners and trusting in citizens' natural courage rather than systems and secrecy. Where Sparta's citizens advance into enemy territory only with all their allies, Athenians invade neighboring lands alone and usually win despite fighting on foreign soil against enemies defending their homes. Athens is not just militarily powerful, but culturally magnificent. The city provides festivals, games, cultural performances throughout the year that refresh the spirit. Private wealth creates beauty and comfort. The world's goods flow to Athens because of its commercial power. Athenians enjoy foreign luxuries as naturally as their own products. In education, while Spartans pursue only military training, Athenians cultivate all aspects of human excellence. In courage, rather than pursuing it through painful discipline, Athenians face danger willingly from rational calculation and love of beauty. The result is what Pericles calls a unique achievement. Athens is the school of Greece. The individual Athenian demonstrates versatility and grace in adapting to varied situations. Athenians prove through deeds that their city's power is no passing achievement, but rests on genuine excellence.
Pericles then makes what might be his boldest claim. Athens alone among Greek cities is greater than its reputation. No enemy need feel shame at being defeated by such a city, nor do subject states complain that their masters are unworthy. Athens has compelled every land and sea to open paths for its power, and has planted eternal monuments of its achievements everywhere. Future ages will marvel at what Athens accomplished. The city needs no Homer or poet to praise it. Its actual deeds speak for themselves. Having praised Athens, Pericles returns to the war dead. These men died for this city, for these ideals, for this way of life. Their deaths prove their worth. They chose to die resisting rather than live submitting. At the summit of their fortune, they escaped not from fear, but into glory. For the survivors, Pericles urges continued dedication to Athens. They should realize Athens' power and literally fall in love with the city, becoming its lovers. Then, when they understand its greatness, they'll remember that it was won by courageous men with a sense of duty and honor. The funeral oration ends by addressing the families of the dead. Their children will be raised at public expense until maturity, a garland of victory for those who fell and encouragement for those who follow. Thucydides gives us Pericles' funeral oration in reported speech, indicating these are not Pericles' exact words, but what Thucydides thought he said or should have said given the situation. The speech presents an idealized vision of Athenian democracy, power, culture, and character. It's simultaneously inspiring and troubling. Inspiring because it articulates democratic values of equality, freedom, merit-based advancement, cultural achievement, and civic dedication with unmatched eloquence. Troubling because it glosses over the empire's reality, the coercion of subject states, the gap between democratic ideals and imperial practice. Thucydides was writing after Athens' defeat, knowing how the war ended. By including this speech in full detail, he preserves both Athenian aspirations at their finest and invites readers to measure them against subsequent events. The second summer of the war began with another Peloponnesian invasion of Attica. But this time, not long after the invasion began, plague broke out in Athens. The disease came, Thucydides tells us, from Ethiopia, passing through Egypt and Libya before reaching the Greek world. It struck Athens with devastating force. Thucydides contracted the plague himself and survived, which gives his description unique authority. He states explicitly that he's recording the symptoms in detail so that if the disease ever returns, people will recognize it. What follows is one of the most powerful descriptions of epidemic disease in ancient literature. The plague began suddenly with violent heat in the head, reddening and inflammation of the eyes. The throat and tongue became bloody, breath unnatural and fetid. Sneezing and hoarseness followed. Then the disease descended to the chest with violent coughing. When it settled in the stomach, it caused vomiting of bile in every form physicians had named, with great distress. Most victims suffered empty retching, producing spasms. The skin was reddish and livid, breaking out in pustules and ulcers. Internally, the fever was so intense that victims couldn't bear even the lightest linen clothing. They wanted to be naked and longed desperately to throw themselves into cold water. Many uncared-for victims did exactly this, plunging into cisterns in raging thirst that was unquenchable no matter how much they drank. Most victims died on the 7th or 9th day from internal fever. If they survived past that point, the disease descended to the bowels, producing violent ulceration and severe diarrhea that killed through weakness. The disease passed through the entire body sequentially. In some survivors, it attacked extremities, causing loss of fingers, toes, and in some cases eyes, or producing complete memory loss so victims didn't recognize themselves or others. The plague was unlike any disease physicians had seen. Nothing helped. What relieved some victims killed others. Strong and weak constitutions proved equally vulnerable. The most terrible aspects weren't just physical, but psychological and social. People died like sheep. Physicians died most frequently because they attended the sick most often. No human art or science helped. Prayers to gods and consultations with oracles proved equally useless. Eventually, people abandoned such attempts. The catastrophe produced complete moral collapse. Most terrible was the utter despair when people realized they had caught the disease. They immediately lost hope and gave up, making recovery less likely. The disease was highly contagious. People caught it from attending sick friends and family. Those who tried to help others died in great numbers. Those who refused to visit the sick left people to die alone in misery. Some households were completely wiped out, with no one to care for them. The traditional customs of caring for sick relatives collapsed. People were afraid. Thucydides describes bodies piled up in temples where the dying had taken refuge, corpses lying in the streets because there was nowhere to bury them, funeral pyres being shared by multiple families because resources were exhausted. The plague broke down all customary restraints. People who were healthy but expected to die soon saw no reason to sacrifice for the future or maintain traditional virtue. Pleasure became the only good, since life seemed brief and uncertain. Property changed hands as wealthy people died and lower-class survivors inherited. People indulged in shameless self-gratification, considering bodies and possessions equally ephemeral. No one expected to live long enough to be punished for crimes or shamed for violations of custom. Traditional honor meant nothing. Religious observance collapsed. People saw that pious and impious died equally, that gods didn't protect the righteous. The Athens Pericles had praised for its cultivation, its beauty, its order, descended into chaos and despair.
Thucydides doesn't explicitly state the connection, but the juxtaposition speaks powerfully. Immediately after Pericles celebrates Athens' openness to the world, a disease enters through the open port. After praising Athens' vast population concentrated in the city, that very concentration becomes a catastrophe as plague spreads uncontrollably in overcrowded conditions. After celebrating cultural sophistication, we see civilization's veneer stripped away to reveal desperate, fearful, selfish human nature. The plague functions as a kind of acid test of Periclean ideals, revealing both the fragility of political achievement and the darker aspects of human nature that emerge under extreme stress. The Athenians, suffering both from the plague and from watching the Spartans ravage their land, turned their anger on Pericles. They blamed him for persuading them into war and for all their misfortunes. They sent ambassadors to Sparta seeking peace, but the Spartans refused. The Athenian assembly turned against Pericles in fury. Pericles, seeing exactly how they were behaving and that it matched his expectations, called an assembly to defend his policy and restore their courage. Pericles' final speech, delivered when he was still general, is very different in tone from the funeral oration. Gone is the soaring celebration of Athenian greatness. Instead, Pericles speaks with tough realism and even bitterness. He acknowledges their anger, but insists it's unjustified. They chose war at his urging, yes, but the decision was rational given the circumstances. Sparta was threatening Athens' independence. Better to fight and possibly lose than to submit without resistance. He reminds them that Athens' empire is like a tyranny, unjust to acquire perhaps, but dangerous to give up. The subjects hate Athens. If Athens shows weakness, they'll revolt. Athens must maintain its power to survive. Pericles addresses their suffering directly. The plague is a calamity beyond anything they could have anticipated, but it's not his fault. It's fortune, chance, the uncontrollable element in human affairs that no wisdom can foresee. They should bear it with dignity rather than losing heart. They're angry with him now, but he's the same person who led them to greatness. If they turn on their leaders in adversity after following them in prosperity, they show themselves fickle and weak. As for the devastation of their land, it's painful but not actually catastrophic. The farms will recover, buildings can be rebuilt. Naval power and the empire matter far more than territory. Athens' power depends on its fleet and its revenues from the empire. These remain intact. The Athenians must maintain discipline, continue the strategy, and not let temporary suffering drive them to foolish decisions. The speech reveals Pericles' character in extremis. He's unrepentant, convinced his strategy is correct despite disaster. He shows some compassion for their suffering, but refuses to apologize or change course. There's pride here and also a certain coldness. He asks them to sacrifice everything for the empire and accept catastrophe as the price of power. The Athenians, temporarily, were convinced. They stopped sending embassies to Sparta. However, they still fined Pericles and briefly removed him from office. Within a short time, they re-elected him as general, reflecting the contradictory character of democratic assemblies that can shift rapidly between anger and forgiveness. But Pericles didn't live long to enjoy his restoration. He witnessed both his legitimate sons, Pericles and Xanthippus, die in the plague. According to Plutarch's later account, Pericles, who had maintained stoic composure through all other losses, broke down weeping at their deaths. In autumn 429 BCE, Pericles himself died, probably from the plague, though Thucydides doesn't explicitly say this. Thucydides later reflects on Pericles' death and its significance for Athens.
As long as Pericles led Athens, he restrained the people's worst impulses, maintained strategic discipline, and governed in the public interest rather than by pandering to popular whims. After his death, inferior leaders took over, men who competed for personal influence rather than pursuing coherent strategy, who flattered the demos to win power rather than providing wise counsel. Athenian policy became erratic and ultimately self-destructive. This suggests Thucydides saw Pericles as irreplaceable, the one leader who could manage democratic Athens' tremendous power while restraining its excesses.
Book 2 ends with accounts of various military operations, sieges, naval battles, raids on Peloponnesian territory, none decisive. Potidaea finally surrendered to Athens in winter 430–429 after a siege that lasted nearly 3 years and cost Athens tremendous amounts of money. The plague continued to recur, breaking out again in 428–427 and killing more thousands. By the time it finally ended, the plague had killed roughly a quarter to a third of Athens' population, perhaps 75,000 to 100,000 people. The losses included not just numbers, but quality. Experienced soldiers, skilled seamen, political leaders, craftsmen, and the irreplaceable human capital of a generation. Athens eventually recovered numerically, but the plague's psychological and social impacts endured. The pairing of the funeral oration and the plague description is Thucydides at his most powerful as a literary artist and historical analyst. The funeral oration presents the aspirational Athens, the city at its ideological height celebrating its values and achievements. The plague reveals the Athens of brutal material reality, where disease doesn't respect democracy or culture, where traditional restraints collapse under pressure, where human nature's darker aspects emerge. Neither vision is complete without the other. Athens was genuinely magnificent in many ways Pericles described. It was also an imperial power built on coercion, whose citizens, like all humans, could descend into selfishness and despair when civilization's supports were stripped away. Thucydides forces readers to hold both truths simultaneously, to admire Athens' achievements while recognizing their fragility and the shadow side of power. This complexity makes the history far more than a chronicle. It becomes a meditation on human possibility and limitation, achievement and catastrophe, the heights we can reach and the depths we can fall to when circumstances turn against us.
Book 3 of Thucydides' history continues the narrative of the war into its 4th and 5th years, but it contains 2 set pieces that transcend mere chronicle to become profound meditations on justice, power, and the corrosive effects of war on human society. The Mytilenean debate explores whether Athens should massacre the population of a rebellious ally, while the account of revolution at Corcyra reveals how war destroys the moral foundations of civilization itself. Together, these passages show Thucydides operating at the height of his powers as both historian and political philosopher. In 428 BCE, the city of Mytilene on the island of Lesbos revolted against Athenian rule. Mytilene was one of the few remaining allies that contributed ships to Athens' navy rather than paying tribute in money. This gave Mytilene substantial autonomy and made them Athens' partners rather than subjects. Yet Mytilene's aristocratic government feared eventual subjugation and plotted to unite Lesbos under their control and defect to Sparta. They began fortifying the city and stockpiling supplies for a long siege. Athens, alerted to these preparations, sent a fleet that blockaded Mytilene. The Mytileneans appealed to Sparta for help. Sparta promised support and even launched a diversionary invasion of Attica, but Spartan aid proved inadequate. After a year of siege, in 427 BCE, Mytilene surrendered.
The Athenian general Pericles sent about 1,000 Mytilenean leaders to Athens for trial while awaiting instructions on how to treat the population. The Athenian assembly, in furious anger at the revolt, voted for the harshest possible punishment: execute all adult Mytilenean males and enslave all women and children. A trireme was immediately dispatched to Pericles with orders to carry out this sentence. It would mean massacring thousands of people, perhaps 20,000 or more men, and destroying an entire city's population. This was extreme, even by the brutal standards of ancient warfare. However, the next day, Athens experienced what Thucydides calls a change of heart. People began reconsidering the decision's severity. Massacring an entire population, including many who had no part in the revolt, seemed excessive and possibly unjust. The Mytilenean ambassadors still in Athens, along with their Athenian supporters, convinced officials to reconvene the assembly for reconsideration. This second assembly produced one of the most famous debates in Thucydides' work between Cleon, arguing to uphold the death sentence, and Diodotus, arguing for leniency.
Cleon was, according to Thucydides, the most violent man in Athens, and at that time most powerful with the common people. He had proposed the original death sentence. Cleon's speech defending his motion begins by attacking democracy itself. Democracies, he argues, are incapable of maintaining empire because they're too indecisive, constantly changing their minds, swayed by clever speakers. The Athenians' current wavering proves his point. Yesterday, they correctly voted for execution. Today, they're being manipulated into mercy by sophistic rhetoric. This inconsistency shows weakness that subject states will exploit. Cleon then argues on grounds of justice. Mytilene's revolt was unjustified. Unlike most Athenian subjects who were oppressed, Mytilene enjoyed privileged status with autonomy, ships, and favorable treatment. Their revolt was therefore not desperate resistance, but deliberate, calculated betrayal. They sided with Athens' bitterest enemies, the Spartans, in an attempt to destroy Athens. This wasn't rebellion driven by oppression, but unprovoked aggression born of arrogance. The entire city bears responsibility. The common people of Mytilene supported the oligarch's revolt. When finally given weapons to defend the city, they immediately demanded surrender, showing they were never truly committed to Athens. Therefore, all Mytileneans are guilty. Justice demands equal punishment for all. If Athens distinguishes between oligarchs and commoners executing only the leaders, this will encourage future revolts. Rebels will calculate that they might succeed, but even if they fail, only the leaders will be punished while the people escape. This destroys deterrence. Athens must make an example so terrible that no other ally will dare revolt. Mercy would be weakness that invites catastrophe. Cleon concludes by warning against being swayed by pity or clemency. These emotions have no place in imperial policy. Athens hold an empire maintained by force. The subjects don't love Athens, they fear it. That fear must be preserved through harsh punishment of rebellion. After Cleon spoke, Diodotus rose to oppose him. Diodotus appears only here in history. We know nothing else about him. His speech is brilliantly constructed as a counter-argument that accepts Cleon's premises but reaches opposite conclusions. Diodotus begins by defending debate itself. Cleon attacked those who would speak against him as bribed or sophistic. But quick decisions made in anger, Diodotus argues, are the enemies of good counsel. Haste and passion are the two greatest obstacles to wisdom. The assembly should welcome competing arguments and deliberate carefully rather than rushing to judgment. Crucially, Diodotus then makes a move that has troubled commentators ever since. He claims the question isn't whether the Mytileneans are guilty, they are, but whether executing them serves Athens' interests. The assembly isn't a law court seeking justice, but a political body determining advantageous policy. Cleon's appeal to justice might seem compelling given Athens' anger, but this is irrelevant. What matters is Athens' benefit. This appears to abandon moral argument entirely for naked self-interest. However, Diodotus's actual arguments are more complex. He challenges Cleon's claim that harsh punishment deters revolt. No punishment, however severe, has ever prevented people from rebelling when they believe they can succeed. Cities contemplating revolt don't assume they'll fail. They believe they'll win, or at least that their cause is desperate enough that they must try regardless of risks. The death penalty exists for many crimes, yet people still commit them. Why would threatened execution deter revolts when it doesn't deter murder or theft? Fear alone cannot maintain empire. If fear were sufficient, Athens could simply threaten extreme punishments and never face resistance. The reality proves otherwise.
Furthermore, Diodotus argues, executing all Mytileneans would be counterproductive. The common people of Mytilene opposed the revolt. When they finally obtained weapons, they immediately used them to surrender the city to Athens. They were Athens' friends, not enemies. If Athens massacres them along with the guilty oligarchs, Athens commits injustice against its benefactors and teaches every subject population a dangerous lesson. There's no point distinguishing between supporting and opposing revolt, since Athens will kill everyone regardless. This guarantees that in future revolts, the common people will support the oligarchs because they have nothing to lose. Moreover, cities that revolt will fight to the death rather than surrender if they know no mercy will be shown. This means longer sieges, more Athenian casualties, more expense, and conquered cities reduced to ruins producing no tribute. Athens' empire exists as a source of revenue. Destroyed cities provide nothing. It's more profitable to accept early surrender from cities where the people turn against rebellious oligarchs than to fight prolonged wars ending in total destruction. Athens should therefore spare the common people of Mytilene, executing only the guilty leaders. This encourages popular factions in other cities to oppose oligarchic revolts and to surrender quickly when revolts occur.
Diodotus concludes by urging Athens to act on rational calculation of interest rather than emotional demands for revenge. Good policy toward enemies surpasses brute force. Justice and expediency don't always align, and when they conflict, expediency must prevail. After both speeches, the assembly voted again. Thucydides tells us the vote was extremely close, with hands almost equal on both sides, but Diodotus's motion narrowly carried. Immediately, a second trireme was dispatched to countermand the original order. The Mytilenean ambassadors promised the crew great rewards if they arrived in time. The rowers slept in shifts, ate at their oars, and rowed day and night with desperate speed. They managed to overtake the first ship's one-day lead and arrived just as Pericles was reading the execution order, in time to prevent the massacre. However, the outcome was still brutal. Athens executed the approximately 1,000 Mytilenean leaders Pericles had selected as most responsible. Athens tore down Mytilene's walls, confiscated its fleet, and divided Lesbos's land, distributing it to Athenian colonists while Mytileneans worked it as tenant farmers paying rent. The revolt was crushed, and Mytilene reduced to subject status. Athens showed some mercy compared to the original sentence, but the punishment remained severe. The Mytilenean debate has fascinated readers for millennia because it explores fundamental questions about justice, power, and practical ethics in politics. Both speakers frame their arguments in terms of Athens' interests rather than moral principles. Cleon explicitly rejects pity and clemency. Diodotus claims justice is irrelevant and only expediency matters. Yet Diodotus's argument, while framed in terms of interest, actually produces a more humane outcome than Cleon's appeal to justice. This creates a paradox. Can we trust speakers who claim to ignore morality? Does Diodotus actually believe expediency alone should guide policy, or is he strategically framing moral arguments in terms he thinks will persuade a democratic assembly that increasingly thinks in terms of power? The debate also reveals Athens' moral evolution during the war. Pericles had argued in the funeral oration that Athens ruled its empire more justly than power required. The Mytilenean debate shows Athens moving toward a purely instrumental view of imperial subjects as revenue sources whose treatment depends entirely on Athens' advantage.
The fact that Diodotus won by the narrowest margin shows Athens balanced precariously between restraint and brutality. Later events would show the balance tipping further toward ruthlessness. Following the Mytilenean debate, Thucydides presents another catastrophe that reveals war's corrosive effects on society, the civil war or stasis at Corcyra. In 427 BCE, Corcyra descended into vicious factional violence between oligarchs who favored Sparta and democrats who favored Athens. The conflict began when Corinth released Corcyrian prisoners of war with instructions to turn Corcyra toward the Peloponnesian alliance. These returned prisoners brought a pro-Athenian leader, Pythias, to trial for enslaving Corcyra to Athens. Pythias was acquitted and retaliated by prosecuting 5 wealthy oligarchs. When convicted, the 5 men burst into the council chamber and killed Pythias and 60 others, triggering open civil war. Later events would show the balance tipping further toward ruthlessness. The city split into armed factions. The Democrats, more numerous and supported by slaves they freed and armed, initially had the upper hand. When a Peloponnesian fleet arrived, the oligarchs rallied but were still outnumbered. The Athenians sent a larger fleet that forced the Peloponnesians to withdraw. With Athens' support assured, the Democrats hunted down the oligarchs systematically. Some oligarchs took refuge in temples as suppliants, traditionally protected by sacred law. The Democrats violated this ancient custom, dragging suppliants from altars and executing them. Others committed suicide, killed each other, or were murdered by creditors settling debts under cover of political violence. Thucydides describes the slaughter in graphic detail, then steps back from narrative to provide broader analysis. What happened at Corcyra, he explains, happened throughout the Greek world as the war progressed. Cities split into democratic and oligarchic factions, with each side seeking support from Athens or Sparta. These factional conflicts produced atrocities and moral collapse that repeated in city after city. Thucydides uses the Corcyra case to analyze the general phenomenon of revolutionary civil war. His analysis is one of the most powerful passages in Greek literature. War, Thucydides declares, is a violent teacher. It brings most people's minds down to the level of their actual circumstances. In peacetime, people maintain higher standards because they're not driven by necessity. War creates conditions of desperation, scarcity, and fear that reveal human nature stripped of civilizing constraints. What emerges is grim. People show themselves incapable of controlling passion, insubordinate to justice, enemies of anything superior to themselves. Vengeance becomes more important than innocence. Profit matters more than justice.
Most strikingly, war corrupts language itself. Words change their meanings. Reckless audacity is now called courageous loyalty to party. Prudent hesitation becomes cowardly evasion. Moderation is dismissed as unmanly weakness. Frantic violence is praised as manly decisiveness. Plotting revenge is considered justifiable self-defense. Anyone advocating compromise is suspected of cowardice. The most violent faction leaders are most trusted. Intelligence becomes suspect because intelligent people see complications and raise objections. Simpler, more violent personalities prevail because they act decisively without reflection. Family bonds weaken while partisan connections strengthen. Fellow faction members become more trusted than blood relatives. Oaths and agreements mean nothing because they're only tactics, to be broken when advantageous. Society divides into 2 ideologically hostile camps with no middle ground. Everyone must choose a side. Moderates, attempting neutrality, are destroyed by both factions. The cause of these evils, Thucydides argues, is the pursuit of power arising from greed and ambition. Under cover of political slogans, equality for the many under democracy, or aristocratic wisdom, leaders actually seek personal power and use any means to achieve it. Ordinary people become tools in struggles between ambitious leaders. The moral implications are devastating. Thucydides is describing not just Corcyra or one historical moment, but patterns he believes will recur as long as human nature remains constant. War creates conditions that strip away civilization's veneer, revealing permanent features of human psychology: desire for power, fear of enemies, rage for revenge, tribal loyalty overriding broader ethics. These forces, normally constrained by law and custom, erupt uncontrollably when war provides both motive and opportunity. The result is predictable horror. The Coursera section influenced later political thought profoundly. It established Thucydides as an analyst not just of interstate relations, but of civil society's breakdown. His depiction of language corruption influenced thinkers from Plato to George Orwell. His analysis of how extremists dominate while moderates perish resonated through the French Revolution, Weimar Germany, and modern civil conflicts. His insistence that these patterns arise from permanent features of human nature rather than temporary circumstances or particular cultures gave his analysis universal rather than merely historical significance. Book 3 thus contains two different but related meditations on power and morality. The Mytilenean debate shows Athens wrestling with how to maintain empire humanely, or at least pragmatically. The narrow vote for mercy represents a moment of restraint before Athens descends further into ruthlessness. The Coursera analysis shows how war destroys internal social order as thoroughly as it disrupts relations between states. Together, these passages reveal Thucydides examining multiple dimensions of war's impact: on interstate behavior, on domestic politics, on moral reasoning, on language itself, and on human character. The message is sobering. War doesn't just kill people and destroy property, it corrupts judgment, perverts values, breaks down civilizing institutions, and reveals the darker aspects of human nature that peacetime conditions usually constrain. This makes war a catastrophe, not just for its immediate victims, but for civilization itself. Book 4 of Thucydides' history covers events in the 7th and 8th years of the war, 425 to 424 BCE, and represents a dramatic turning point. Athens achieves its most spectacular victory of the entire conflict at Pylos and Sphacteria, capturing Spartan soldiers and shattering the myth of Spartan invincibility. Yet this triumph is quickly followed by Athenian setbacks, including a devastating defeat at Dilium and the loss of Amphipolis to the brilliant Spartan general Brasidas. The year also marks a personal turning point for Thucydides himself, as his failure to save Amphipolis results in his exile from Athens, the exile that paradoxically enabled him to write his masterwork. The Pylos campaign began almost accidentally in the summer of 425 BCE. An Athenian fleet under generals Eurymedon and Sophocles was sailing to Sicily, with the general Demosthenes aboard as advisor. Demosthenes had proposed occupying and fortifying a rocky promontory called Pylos on the southwest coast of the Peloponnese, in territory that had once belonged to Messenia before Sparta conquered it. Pylos lay only about 45 miles from Sparta itself and could serve as a base for raids into Spartan territory and as a refuge for Helots, the enslaved Messenian population whose labor sustained Sparta's military system. If Helots could escape to an Athenian-held fortress, it would threaten Sparta's economy and social order. The fleet's commanders initially rejected Demosthenes' plan, but when bad weather forced the ships to shelter at Pylos, the Athenian soldiers, bored during the delay, spontaneously began fortifying the headland. Once they had started construction, the generals relented and left Demosthenes with 5 ships and their crews as garrison, while the main fleet continued to Sicily. The occupation took place during the annual Spartan invasion of Attica. When news reached King Agis, who was leading the invasion, he immediately ended it after only 15 days and rushed his army home to deal with this threat in Spartan territory. The Spartans planned both immediate and long-term responses. In the short term, they would assault the hastily built Athenian fortifications, expecting easy victory. For the longer term, they would block the harbor. Pylos sits at one end of a bay protected by the island of Sphacteria, which runs north-south across the bay's mouth. This creates a natural harbor with two narrow entrances, one passage wide enough for 2 ships, the other for 8 or 9. The Spartans planned to block these entrances with ships positioned prow outward, while posting troops on Sphacteria to prevent Athenian use of the island. This would trap Demosthenes by sea while besieging him by land. The plan failed catastrophically. When the Spartan fleet attacked Pylos, they assaulted exactly where Demosthenes expected and found him prepared to resist. The rocky coastline made landing difficult, and only a few triremes could approach at once. The Spartan commander Brasidas showed extraordinary courage, driving his ship directly onto the rocks and attempting to disembark, but was severely wounded. Repeated Spartan attacks broke against determined Athenian defense. Meanwhile, Demosthenes had sent 2 ships to summon the Athenian fleet from nearby Zakynthos. The Athenian fleet arrived before the Spartans could block the harbor entrances. In the ensuing naval battle, the Athenians routed the Spartan ships. More significantly, they now controlled the waters around Sphacteria, trapping approximately 420 Spartan hoplites on the island. Among these were about 120 Spartiates, full Spartan citizens, the elite core of Sparta's military power. This was an unprecedented disaster. Sparta's entire military system depended on the superiority and invincibility of Spartiates in land combat. Now a substantial number were cut off, facing starvation or surrender.
The Spartans immediately sought an armistice. They surrendered their entire fleet to Athens as guarantee of good conduct and sent ambassadors to Athens to negotiate peace. The Spartan embassy's speech, as reported by Thucydides, appeals to Athens' long-term interests. The Spartans argue that fortune is changeable, that Athens now holds an advantage but might someday need Spartan goodwill, and that making peace from a position of strength creates lasting friendship. They suggest that Athens and Sparta should become allies rather than enemies, working together to maintain order in the Greek world. The speech is notably conciliatory and pragmatic, acknowledging Athens' current superiority. However, the politician Cleon opposed accepting the Spartan offer. Cleon demanded far harsher terms. Sparta must surrender Nicaea, Pegae, Troezen, and Achaia, territories Athens had been forced to give up in the 30 Years' Peace of 445 BCE, when Athens was at a disadvantage. When the Spartans asked to discuss these demands privately with a small Athenian committee, Cleon violently objected. He insisted they speak publicly before the entire assembly. This guaranteed failure of negotiations, since the Spartans could hardly discuss betraying their allies in public. Unable to make concessions openly that would destroy their credibility with allies, and finding Athens unwilling to grant reasonable terms, the Spartan ambassadors returned home without agreement. The armistice ended, and Athens kept the Spartan ships, claiming the Spartans had violated the truce.
Both sides now settled in to determine the fate of the men on Sphacteria through siege. The Spartans attempted to smuggle supplies to the island using divers who swam underwater, dragging skins of poppy seed mixed with honey and crushed linseed. The Athenians maintained close blockade with ships patrolling day and night. Weeks passed with no resolution. The Athenians grew frustrated. In the assembly, Cleon attacked the generals conducting the siege for incompetence. One of the generals, Nicias, challenged Cleon. If the operation is so easy, why doesn't Cleon go conduct it himself? Cleon tried to avoid this challenge, but the assembly, delighted at the prospect, demanded he take command. Trapped by his own rhetoric, Cleon made an extraordinary boast. He would capture or kill the Spartans on Sphacteria within 20 days. Thucydides reports that the Athenians laughed at his foolishness, while more sensible citizens reflected that either way they would benefit. Either they would be rid of Cleon, which they hoped, or he would actually capture the Spartans. Cleon chose as his colleague the general Demosthenes, already at Pylos, and departed with reinforcements.
What happened next validated Cleon's boast, though Thucydides attributes this to luck rather than skill.
Demosthenes had been waiting for an opportunity to assault the island, but had held back because Sphacteria was covered in thick woods, giving the Spartan hoplites defensive advantage against landing forces. An accidental fire, started by a soldier's careless campfire, burned away much of the vegetation, exposing the terrain and revealing that the Spartans were more numerous than expected. This changed Demosthenes' tactical assessment. He now knew the ground and enemy numbers and could plan an assault using light-armed troops to harass the heavily armored Spartans. The Athenians landed in overwhelming force, hoplites, archers, peltasts, and light-armed troops totaling perhaps 8,000 men against the 420 Spartans. The battle unfolded in a manner shocking to Greek military convention. The Spartan hoplites, renowned for close combat excellence, found themselves unable to come to grips with their enemies. The Athenian light troops, archers, slingers, javelin men, surrounded the Spartans and pelted them with missiles from safe distance. The Spartans charged to drive them off, but the light troops simply retreated and renewed their attack from another angle. Dust kicked up by thousands of feet reduced visibility. The Spartans couldn't see clearly enough to coordinate, couldn't catch their tormentors, and suffered mounting casualties from missiles they couldn't counter.
The battle lasted for hours under the hot sun. The Spartans, exhausted, wounded, and surrounded, found their position hopeless. Their commander, Epitatus, was killed. His second-in-command, Styphon, also fell. The third officer, Styphon's son of Pharax, consulted with his surviving men and then surrendered. This moment represents perhaps the greatest psychological shock of the entire war. Spartans were expected to die rather than surrender. At Thermopylae, Leonidas and the 300 had fought to the death. Spartan mothers famously told their sons to return with their shields or on them, victorious or dead, never defeated and alive. Yet here were Spartiates surrendering to save their lives. Thucydides records that Greeks found this the most unexpected thing in the war. People asked the prisoners whether the dead were the finest and best of Sparta. One captive replied sardonically that arrows would be worth a lot if they could distinguish the brave from the cowards, meaning the random slaughter by missiles gave no opportunity for traditional Spartan valor. About 292 Spartans surrendered, including 120 Spartiates. They were taken to Athens as hostages, and the Athenians announced that if Sparta invaded Attica again, the prisoners would be executed. Cleon had fulfilled his promise within the 20 days. Pylos remained in Athenian hands, serving as a base for raiding Spartan territory and receiving Helot refugees. The annual Spartan invasions of Attica, which had occurred every year since the war began, now ceased.
Yet Athens' fortunes reversed with shocking speed. In late 424 BCE, Athens suffered a crushing defeat in Boeotia at the Battle of Delium. The Athenian generals Demosthenes and Hippocrates had planned a complex operation to destabilize the Boeotian League by coordinating with pro-Athenian democratic factions. Demosthenes would seize Siphae on the coast, while Hippocrates fortified the temple at Delium. Simultaneous uprisings would fragment Boeotian resistance. The plan collapsed when it was betrayed to the Boeotians. Demosthenes arrived at Siphae to find it heavily defended and was forced to withdraw. Hippocrates nevertheless proceeded with his part of the operation, arriving at Delium with about 7,000 hoplites, plus cavalry and light troops. They fortified the temple precinct over 5 days. Then Hippocrates sent most of the army back toward Athens, while he followed with the hoplites. The Boeotians, commanded by the Theban general Panjondas, gathered their forces at Tanagra. When they saw the Athenians departing, many Boeotians thought pursuit pointless. But Panjondas argued that Athens would return to use Delium as a permanent base for invasions and convinced his army to attack. The Boeotians had roughly equal numbers of hoplites, but superior cavalry and far more light troops. Critically, the Thebans on the right wing deployed their hoplites 25 ranks deep, far deeper than the normal 8 ranks. This created an unstoppable mass that could punch through enemy lines by sheer weight. The two armies met, hidden from each other by a hill.
When they came in sight, both sides charged. The battle was hard-fought. The Athenian left wing was defeating the Boeotian right, surrounding and nearly destroying the contingent from Thespiae. But the deep Theban phalanx on the Boeotian right pushed the Athenians back relentlessly. Pongondus sent his cavalry around the hill to support the struggling Boeotian left. When this cavalry appeared on the Athenian right flank, the Athenians believed it was a fresh army and panicked. The Athenian right broke and fled. The panic spread, and the entire Athenian line disintegrated. The Boeotians pursued until nightfall. Athens lost nearly 1,000 men, including General Hippocrates. The Boeotians lost about 500. Among the Athenian survivors was the philosopher Socrates, fighting as a hoplite. Plato later recorded Alcibiades' description of Socrates' calm courage during the chaotic retreat. The survivors fell back to the fort at Delium, where peculiar dispute arose. The Boeotians demanded the Athenians leave sacred ground. The Athenians replied that the land was now theirs and sacred to them. For 2 weeks, negotiations stalled. Then the Boeotians, reinforced by 2,000 Corinthian hoplites, constructed an ingenious device described by Thucydides, a large wooden beam hollowed out and fitted back together like a pipe, with a cauldron at one end suspended by chains and bellows attached. The cauldron was filled with lighted coals, sulfur, and pitch. This early flamethrower projected fire against Delium's wooden fortifications, igniting them. The Athenian garrison fled. About 200 more Athenians died, the rest escaped. Delium was a costly defeat that offset the psychological impact of Sphacteria. Simultaneously, the Spartan general Brasidas was revolutionizing the war in the north. In 424 BCE, Brasidas gained permission to lead an expedition to Thrace, where Athens controlled valuable allies and colonies. Brasidas gathered an army of 700 helots armed as hoplites, a radical innovation showing Sparta's desperate need for manpower, and 1,000 Peloponnesian mercenaries. After helping repel an Athenian attack on Megara, he marched his small force the entire length of Greece through Thessaly to reach Thrace. There he allied with King Pericles of Macedon. Brasidas was unlike typical Spartans. He was an inspiring speaker, a skilled diplomat, and offered generous terms to cities that came over to Sparta. His moderate demands and personal charisma won him allies without fighting. In late 424 BCE, Brasidas targeted Amphipolis, an Athenian colony on the Strymon River. Amphipolis was strategically vital, controlling nearby silver mines that helped fund Athens' war effort. The city was defended by the Athenian general Eucles. When Brasidas approached, Eucles sent to the historian general Thucydides, who was at the island of Thasos, half a day's sail away with 7 ships, requesting immediate assistance. Brasidas, aware of Thucydides' presence and influence in the region through his family's gold mining interests, acted with characteristic speed. He offered Amphipolis remarkably generous terms. Anyone who wished to stay could keep their property with full rights of citizenship under Spartan protection. Anyone who wished to leave had 5 days to depart with their belongings. The majority of Amphipolis's inhabitants were not Athenian colonists, but locals and people from various places. Many had relatives among the Spartan prisoners outside the walls. Facing Brasidas's moderate terms versus uncertain relief, they accepted surrender. Thucydides arrived at the port of Eion the same evening Amphipolis surrendered, just in time to secure Eion and prevent its capture. But he had failed to save Amphipolis. The loss caused consternation in Athens. Amphipolis was too valuable, the defeat too embarrassing. Someone had to be blamed. Thucydides was exiled, probably through prosecution by his enemies, possibly including Cleon. He would spend the next 20 years in exile, a period he described matter-of-factly.
It was also my fate to be in exile from my country for 20 years after my command at Amphipolis, and being present with both parties, and more especially with the Peloponnesians by reason of my exile, I had leisure to observe affairs somewhat particularly.
This exile, while personally humiliating, proved historically invaluable. Thucydides could now travel freely, interview participants from both sides, and observe events with detachment impossible for someone actively involved in Athenian politics. His failure as a general created the conditions for his success as a historian. Brasidas continued his successes, capturing several more cities, including Torone. In spring 423 BCE, Athens and Sparta agreed to a one-year truce, but Brasidas violated it by accepting the revolt of Cyane, which occurred 2 days after the truce began, and occupying Mendi. Athens sent Nicias with a fleet that recaptured Mendi and besieged Cyane. The truce expired with basic issues unresolved. Book 4 thus presents a year of wild reversals. Athens achieved its greatest victory at Sphacteria, humiliating Sparta by capturing Spartiates, something previously unthinkable. Yet Athens suffered serious defeats at Delium and Amphipolis, losing a major battle and a crucial colony. The Spartan Brasidas emerged as a military genius whose diplomatic skills and strategic vision made him Athens' most dangerous enemy. Cleon, despite his success at Sphacteria, remained a controversial figure whom Thucydides clearly despised. And Thucydides himself became a casualty of the war's political pressures, exiled for failure, but thereby positioned to write history's greatest war narrative. The year 424 BCE demonstrated the war's essential character: fluid, unpredictable, with fortune shifting rapidly and neither side able to secure permanent advantage.
Book 5 of Thucydides' history covers the years 421 to 416 BCE and represents a transitional period marked by a failed peace, shifting alliances, and Athens' descent into naked imperialism. The book opens with the deaths of the war's two most aggressive leaders, Brasidas and Cleon, at the Battle of Amphipolis in 422 BCE, which finally made peace possible. Yet the peace of Nicias that followed in spring 421 BCE proved hollow from the start, maintaining only a facade of settlement while hostilities continued in new forms. The book culminates in the Melian dialogue, one of the most famous passages in all of Thucydides, where Athens abandons even the pretense of moral justification for its imperialism and argues nakedly from power. In 422 BCE, Cleon led an Athenian expedition to Thrace, attempting to recapture Amphipolis and reverse Brasidas' gains. Both generals showed characteristic styles. Brasidas held Amphipolis with about 2,000 hoplites, 300 cavalry, and additional light troops. Cleon commanded approximately 1,200 Athenian hoplites, 300 cavalry, and larger numbers of allied troops. Brasidas, outnumbered but strategically positioned, waited inside the city while Cleon conducted reconnaissance. When Cleon began a poorly organized retreat, Brasidas saw his opportunity and attacked boldly with select forces, achieving complete surprise. The Athenian army panicked and fled. About 600 Athenians died, including Cleon himself. Spartan losses were minimal, only 7 men according to Thucydides, but among them was Brasidas, mortally wounded, leading the assault. Both men died fighting, removing from their respective cities the leaders most committed to continuing war. The Amphipolitans buried Brasidas with extraordinary honors, treating him as their founder rather than the original Athenian colonizer Hagnon, instituting annual games and sacrifices in his memory. His tomb became a hero shrine. For Athens, Cleon's death removed the politician who had most consistently opposed compromise. For Sparta, Brasidas' loss eliminated their most innovative and successful commander.
With both warhawks dead, moderates on both sides could finally pursue serious negotiations. In spring 421 BCE, 17 representatives from each city swore oaths to uphold what became known as the Peace of Nicias, named after the Athenian general who led negotiations. The treaty was supposed to last 50 years. Thucydides notes with characteristic precision that it was signed just 10 years, with the difference of a few days, after the first invasion of Attica and the beginning of this war. The treaty's main principle was status quo ante bellum. Each side would keep what it currently held, though with some adjustments. Sparta agreed to return Amphipolis to Athens. Athens would evacuate Pylos. Prisoners would be exchanged, including the Spartans captured at Sphacteria. Both sides would guarantee mutual defense. If either were invaded, the other would provide assistance. However, the treaty contained fatal flaws from the beginning. Sparta's key allies, Corinth, Megara, Elis, and Thebes, refused to sign, viewing the terms as betraying their interests after they had borne the war's heaviest burdens, while Sparta abandoned them at the negotiating table. Thucydides identifies the personal motivations of the main negotiators with cynical insight. Nicias desired to end his military career without disaster, preserving his reputation. Sparta's king Pleistenox, who had been exiled for 19 years before controversial restoration, hoped the return of prisoners would distract from questions about his legitimacy. Neither leader acted primarily from conviction that peace served their city's long-term interests. Both sought personal advantage. More fundamentally, key treaty provisions were never implemented. Sparta could not deliver Amphipolis because the city refused to return to Athenian control. The Thracian cities that had revolted preferred independence and ignored Spartan directives. Thebes refused to return the border fortress of Panactum to Athens and ultimately demolished it rather than hand it over intact. Athens, seeing Sparta unable to fulfill treaty obligations, retained Pylos. Within months, both sides were accusing each other of violations. Thucydides makes clear he considers the peace largely nominal. He reports it lasted 6 years and 10 months, but qualifies this carefully. This refers only to the period when neither side directly invaded the other's territory. In reality, warfare continued through proxies and allies almost immediately.
The treaty's failure catalyzed new alliance patterns. Corinth, deeply dissatisfied with Sparta's abandonment, began agitating for a new coalition. They convinced Argos, the major power in the Peloponnese that had remained neutral throughout the Archidamian War, to form a defensive alliance aimed at reducing Spartan dominance. Over the next years, this anti-Spartan league grew to include Mantinea, Elis, and most significantly Athens, creating a direct Athenian presence in the Peloponnese. Ironically, Corinth itself soon lost enthusiasm and remained loyal to Sparta. But the alliance it had initiated posed a mortal threat to Spartan hegemony. By 418 BCE, the situation demanded resolution through battle. When the coalition prepared to attack Tegea, a crucial Spartan ally, Sparta could retreat no further. King Agis II led what Thucydides calls the finest Greek army assembled up to that time northward. The resulting Battle of Mantinea became the largest land battle fought within Greece during the entire Peloponnesian War. Agis commanded approximately 9,000 hoplites, roughly 3,600 Spartans, 600 Syrikae, elite mountain troops, 2,000 veterans from Brasidas' campaigns, now free helots, and 3,000 Arcadians, including Tegans. The Allied coalition fielded a roughly equivalent force, 4,000 to 5,000 Argives, including 1,000 elite picked troops, 2,000 to 3,000 Mantineans and Arcadian allies, and 1,000 Athenian hoplites with 300 cavalry.
The battle unfolded with characteristic hoplite dynamics. As both armies advanced, each right wing extended beyond the opposing left, a common pattern caused by each man seeking cover behind his neighbor's shield. Agis attempted complex maneuvers to strengthen his line, ordering units to shift position, but his commands arrived too late to execute properly. Gaps opened in the Spartan line. The Mantineans and Argive elite troops exploited these openings, breaking through and routing the Spartan left. For a moment, Spartan defeat seemed possible. But the Spartan center and right, including King Agis with the 300-strong royal guard, the Hippi, crashed into the Argive center and Athenian left with devastating effect. The Argives and Athenians broke almost immediately, fleeing without sustained resistance. Panic spread. When the Mantineans, who were winning on their wing, saw the rest of the allied army routed, they abandoned their pursuit and retreated. The Spartans pursued until nightfall. Casualties reflected the one-sided nature of the victory. The Allied coalition lost approximately 1,100 men, 700 Argives and Arcadians, 200 Athenians, and 200 Mantineans. Sparta lost only about 300.
The battle's significance transcended mere numbers. Thucydides emphasizes that Mantinea rescued Sparta's reputation. After Sphacteria, Sparta had been considered cowardly and incompetent. Questions about Spartan military effectiveness, even Spartan courage, circulated throughout Greece. Mantinea answered those questions definitively. The victory restored Spartan prestige and broke the anti-Spartan coalition. Argos made peace and formed an alliance with Sparta. The democratic government of Argos fell to an oligarchic coup supported by Sparta. Spartan hegemony over the Peloponnese was re-established. For Athens, Mantinea represented a missed opportunity. Had the coalition won, Spartan power might have been broken permanently. Instead, Athens' own forces had performed poorly, contributing to the defeat, and Athens now faced a strengthened and confident Sparta. In summer 416 BCE, during this period of nominal peace with Sparta, Athens turned its attention to the small island of Melos in the Aegean. Melos was a Spartan colony that had maintained neutrality during the war, though after Athenian raids in 426 BCE, it had assumed an attitude of open hostility, according to Thucydides, though it took no active part in fighting. Athens sent an overwhelming force. 30 Athenian ships, plus 6 Chian and 2 Lesbian vessels, carrying 1,600 Athenian hoplites, 300 archers, 20 mounted archers, and approximately 1,500 allied hoplites. The generals Cleomedes and Tisias commanded this expedition. Before commencing hostilities, the Athenians sent envoys demanding Melos join the Delian League and pay tribute, or face destruction. The Melian magistrates agreed to meet the envoys privately rather than before the people, fearing Athenian rhetorical skill might sway the populace. What followed is the famous Melian dialogue, presented by Thucydides not as a narrative account, but as a dramatic back-and-forth exchange, unique in his history's structure. The dialogue begins with the Athenians proposing its unusual format. Rather than set speeches, they suggest the Melians interrupt and respond to each point. The Melians note ironically that this quiet instruction ill accords with Athenian military preparations already underway. The Athenians respond with brutal frankness. They will not waste time with moral justifications, claiming rights to empire from defeating Persia or that Melos has wronged Athens. They expect the Melians similarly to avoid appeals to justice, noting that Melos hasn't joined Sparta despite ancestral ties, or that Melos has done Athens no harm. All such arguments are irrelevant.
Instead, the Athenians declare both sides should address only what is realistic given the power differential. Right, as the world goes, is only in question between equals in power, while the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. This sentence has echoed through 2,500 years of political philosophy as perhaps the starkest statement of political realism ever articulated. Justice exists only between equals. Where power is unequal, power determines outcomes. Morality is a luxury the weak cannot afford and the strong need not observe. The Melians respond that even from purely self-interested grounds, Athens should respect principles of justice. These principles serve everyone's long-term interest, for all may someday find themselves in danger needing fair play and just dealing. Destroying these principles for short-term advantage ultimately harms the destroyer. The Athenians counter that accepting Melian neutrality would show weakness. Athens' subject states would interpret restraint as inability to conquer Melos. Allowing neutrality invites rebellion. The empire's security requires demonstrating that resistance means annihilation. The Melians argue this reasoning is flawed. Destroying a neutral state will drive other neutrals towards Sparta for protection, creating enemies unnecessarily. The Athenians dismiss this. Mainland states don't concern them. Those recognize Athenian power. Island states matter because they might think Athens weak if it tolerates independence. The Melians invoke hope and divine favor. They trust the gods will support them since they are just men fighting the unjust. They expect Sparta will aid its colonists. The Athenians respond with cold calculation. Hope is dangerous for the weak. The gods favor the powerful. Divine law, like natural law, is that the strong rule the weak. As for Sparta, its interests lie in self-preservation, not rescuing distant colonies at risk to themselves. Expedience counsels Sparta to abandon Melos. The dialogue concludes with the Melians politely but firmly refusing submission. They will not exchange 700 years of freedom for slavery. Better to die free than live subjugated. The Athenians depart warning there is no shame in yielding to vastly superior force, urging the Melians to choose survival over honor. The Melians are unmoved. The siege followed. Athens blockaded Melos by land and sea. The Melians defended stubbornly despite being hopelessly outnumbered. Athens withdrew most forces to fight elsewhere, leaving enough to maintain the blockade. In winter 416-415 BCE, internal betrayal enabled Athens to capture the city. The punishment was severe even by ancient standards. Every adult Melian male was executed. All women and children were sold into slavery. Melos was depopulated. Athens later sent 500 colonists to resettle the island. The destruction was complete. The Melian dialogue has fascinated readers for millennia because it crystallizes fundamental questions about power and morality in politics. The Athenians articulate pure political realism. Power creates its own justification. Morality is irrelevant to international relations. Self-interest alone should guide policy. The Melians represent a more idealistic view. Principles of justice serve all in the long run. Power restrained by morality is sustainable, while power unchecked leads to ruin. Short-term advantage gained through injustice ultimately proves self-destructive. Thucydides does not explicitly endorse either position. He presents both arguments forcefully, yet his narrative context suggests interpretation. Immediately following Melos, Athens embarks on the Sicilian expedition, its greatest disaster. The pattern implies that unchecked power and moral arrogance lead to overreach and catastrophe. Athens, having abandoned any pretense that justice constrains power, loses perspective on what power can actually achieve. The destruction of Melos becomes a stepping stone to Athens' own near destruction in Sicily. Book 5 thus charts Athens' transformation, beginning with the possibility of genuine peace after Brasidas and Cleon's deaths. It shows how structural factors, mutual mistrust, dissatisfied allies, imperial logic, made peace impossible. The Battle of Mantinea demonstrates that military power remains decisive and that Spartan supremacy in land warfare is restored.
The Melian dialogue reveals how completely Athens has embraced imperial ruthlessness, discarding even rhetorical nods to justice or moderation. The book ends with Athens poised for its greatest gamble, the attempt to conquer Sicily, having learned nothing from its growing moral isolation and strategic overextension. Thucydides is positioning readers to understand the disaster that follows as not merely military miscalculation, but the inevitable consequence of power divorced from wisdom and justice. Books 6 and 7 of Thucydides' history form a unified narrative of Athens' greatest disaster, the Sicilian expedition of 415 to 413 BCE. These books represent Thucydides at the height of his literary powers, crafting a tragedy that moves inexorably from ambition and hubris through miscalculation and missed opportunities to complete catastrophe. The expedition destroyed Athens' finest army and navy, killing or enslaving tens of thousands, and transformed the war from one Athens might still win into one it would inevitably lose. Thucydides presents the disaster as both military failure and moral judgment, the consequence of Athens' abandonment of Periclean restraint for unlimited imperial ambition. In early 415 BCE, Athens received an appeal from Segesta, a city in Sicily embroiled with war with neighboring Selinus. Segestans requested Athenian military assistance and sent ambassadors to Athens bringing 60 talents of silver as 1 month's pay for 60 ships. They claimed abundant wealth awaited Athens in Sicily's temples and treasuries. The Athenian assembly held debates that quickly divided along factional lines between those advocating peace and those demanding expansion.
Nicias, who had negotiated the peace treaty bearing his name, opposed the expedition. He warned that Athens would leave powerful enemies behind. Sparta might break the peace while attacking distant foes too numerous and strong to conquer easily. Sicily's Greek cities were large, independent, and well-defended. Conquering them would require massive resources and prolonged effort. Athens should consolidate existing empire, not pursue reckless expansion. He reminded Athenians that their young men were dead or imprisoned from recent wars, that treasury and fleet needed rebuilding, that prudence counseled restraint. Alcibiades, brilliant, ambitious, and charismatic, argued passionately for intervention. He dismissed Nicias's caution as timidity unworthy of Athens' imperial destiny. Athens had obligations to Sicilian allies that honor demanded fulfilling. Moreover, empires cannot stand still. They must expand or decline. Sitting idle invites enemies to grow strong and allies to defect. By conquering Sicily, Athens would gain wealth and resources to overwhelm Sparta. Sicily would provide grain, ships, money, and manpower. Beyond Sicily lay Carthage and limitless possibilities. Alcibiades appealed to Athenian pride, ambition, and the entrepreneurial spirit that built the empire. He himself was exceedingly ambitious of a command by which he hoped to reduce Sicily and Carthage, and personally to gain in wealth and reputation. The assembly clearly favored Alcibiades. Seeing he could not prevent the expedition by direct opposition, Nicias changed tactics. If Athens insisted on this dangerous venture, it must send overwhelming force. He described Sicily's wealth and power in exaggerated terms, demanding far more ships, hoplites, cavalry, and supplies than initially proposed. His strategy was transparent: make the expedition so expensive that the assembly would reject it. The tactic backfired spectacularly. The assembly, rather than being deterred by the enormous cost, became even more enthusiastic. They approved an armada vastly larger than originally planned, approximately 134 warships, 100 from Athens, the rest from allies, carrying about 5,100 hoplites, plus archers, slingers, and light troops. The total force eventually exceeded 40,000 men.
This became the largest and most expensive expedition Athens had ever mounted. Thucydides notes the irony. Nicias's attempt to prevent disaster by demanding excessive resources instead guaranteed that when disaster came, it would be catastrophic. The assembly appointed 3 commanders with full powers: Alcibiades, Nicias, and Lamachus. Lamachus was a professional soldier, experienced but less politically prominent. Alcibiades and Nicias despised each other, one young, radical, and aggressive, the other old, conservative, and cautious. Their rivalry would plague the expedition.
On the night before departure, Vandals mutilated many of Athens's Hermae, stone pillars with carved heads of Hermes placed throughout the city. These sacred markers protected travelers and guaranteed good fortune. Their destruction horrified Athens. Was it a bad omen presaging disaster, or deliberate sacrilege suggesting conspiracy to overthrow democracy? Alcibiades' enemies, particularly the politician Androcles, accused him of responsibility, citing his reputation for impiety and wild behavior. Alcibiades demanded immediate trial to clear his name before sailing. His enemies refused, allowing him to depart but planning to recall him once the fleet reached Sicily, when he would be vulnerable to prosecution without his supporters present. In summer 415 BCE, the magnificent armada departed amid great ceremony. Thucydides describes the spectacle. The whole population of Athens came to Piraeus to witness the fleet's departure, citizens and foreigners alike marveling at its size and splendor. The ships were adorned, prayers offered, paeans sung. It was Athens' imperial power in glorious display, and it sailed toward annihilation.
Upon reaching Sicily, the Athenians discovered Segesta's wealth was largely fictitious. The city had displayed the same gold and silver vessels in multiple locations to create an illusion of abundance. The promised funding did not exist. The expedition's financial premise collapsed immediately. The 3 generals now debated strategy. Nicias proposed fulfilling the minimal obligation, settling the dispute between Segesta and Silenus through show of force or diplomacy, then returning home. Lamachus advocated immediate attack on Syracuse before it could prepare defenses. Alcibiades argued for a middle course, use diplomacy to gather Sicilian allies, establish a secure base at Catana, then attack Syracuse with maximum force. Lamachus, holding the deciding vote, sided with Alcibiades. But before strategy could be implemented, a ship arrived from Athens summoning Alcibiades to trial for the Hermae sacrilege and other impiety charges. Rather than return to certain conviction and probable execution, Alcibiades escaped and fled to Sparta, Athens' mortal enemy. There he provided devastating intelligence, advising Spartans exactly how to defeat the Sicilian expedition and how to strike Athens' home territory. He urged Sparta send a general to organize Syracuse's defense and to fortify Decelea in Attica, enabling permanent year-round occupation of Athenian territory. Both recommendations proved catastrophic for Athens.
With Alcibiades gone, Nicias and Lamachus proceeded cautiously. They sailed to Syracuse's great harbor, defeated the Syracusans in one battle, then inexplicably withdrew to Catana for winter 415 to 414 BCE. This gave Syracuse precious months to prepare. What should have been quick conquest became prolonged siege. The Syracusans appealed to their mother city, Corinth, and to Sparta. Sparta, finally breaking the peace of Nicias, sent the general Gylippus with reinforcements. Corinth sent additional troops and ships. In spring 414 BCE, the Athenians returned to Syracuse and began systematic siege operations. They landed on the Epipolae Plateau north of Syracuse and constructed a circular fort as headquarters. From there, they began building 2 siege walls, one north toward Trogelus, another south to the Great Harbor, designed to completely encircle Syracuse and cut it off from supplies. The Syracusans attempted countermeasures, building their own walls to block Athenian progress, but initially without success. During fighting around these fortifications, Lamachus was killed, leaving the sick and indecisive Nicias in sole command. Despite this loss, the siege progressed. The northern wall remained incomplete for lack of timber, but the southern wall neared completion. Syracuse prepared to surrender. Then everything changed. Gylippus arrived with Corinthian and Spartan reinforcements, landing in northern Sicily and marching unopposed to Syracuse. Nicias failed to intercept him. Gylippus immediately galvanized Syracusan resistance. He extended a counterwall that prevented Athenians from completing their encirclement. When finished, this counterwall meant Syracuse could always receive supplies. The besiegers became besieged. Gylippus captured the Athenian fort at Labdalum. He defeated Nicias's attempts to stop the counterwall. He then seized the Athenian base at Plemmyrium across the Great Harbor, capturing stockpiles of equipment and destroying Athenian naval superiority in the harbor. Nicias, recognizing his position was now hopeless, sent a letter to Athens, not trusting messengers to convey the dire situation accurately, requesting either recall of the expedition or massive reinforcements. Athens chose reinforcements, dispatching approximately 73 ships with 5,000 hoplites under the general Demosthenes, not the famous orator, but the victor of Pylos. Before reinforcements arrived, the Syracusans gained confidence and began attacking aggressively. They developed new naval tactics suited to the confined harbor waters, strengthening their ships' prows for head-on ramming rather than the maneuvers Athenian skill favored. In spring 413 BCE, they won a series of naval victories in the Great Harbor, demoralizing the Athenians. When Demosthenes arrived in summer 413 BCE with the second massive army, he immediately grasped the situation's hopelessness. The Athenians could not complete the siege with Gylippus's counterwall in place. Demosthenes proposed a bold night attack to capture the counterwall and restore the siege. The attack initially succeeded, breaking through Syracusan positions, but darkness caused confusion. Athenian units lost formation, some began fighting each other in the darkness, and Syracusan counterattacks drove them back in chaos. The attack collapsed with heavy casualties. Demosthenes now advised immediate evacuation. The expedition had failed. Remaining meant total destruction. Better to cut losses and preserve what forces remained. Nicias refused. He claimed secret contacts in Syracuse promised imminent betrayal of the city, though he provided no evidence. He feared the disgrace of returning home defeated. The commanders deadlocked while the army remained trapped. Then, on August 27, 413 BCE, a total lunar eclipse occurred. The army's soothsayers interpreted this as an omen, forbidding movement for thrice 9 days, 27 days. Nicias, deeply superstitious, accepted this advice and ordered the army to wait. This decision sealed Athens' fate. The delay gave Syracuse time to prepare the final blow. The Syracusans, now commanded by Hermocrates in collaboration with Gylippus, launched a massive naval attack in the harbor with 76 ships against 60 Athenian ships. They used the confined space to neutralize Athenian naval skill. The battle became a brutal melee of ships crashing together, marines fighting across decks, oars entangled. The Syracusans placed a boom of chained merchant ships across the harbor mouth, trapping the Athenians. After fierce fighting, Syracuse won decisively, destroying or capturing many Athenian ships. Athens lost approximately 50 ships, Syracuse about 26. The Athenians now faced total disaster. They could no longer escape by sea. They decided on a desperate overland retreat toward friendly Sicilian cities about 80 miles away. The army, maybe 40,000 men when fully reinforced, now numbered maybe 20,000 effective troops, the rest killed, wounded, or sick. They abandoned fortifications, destroyed equipment they couldn't carry, and set out at night hoping to evade pursuers.
The retreat became a nightmare. Syracusan cavalry harassed constantly. The Athenians lacked adequate cavalry for protection. Men fell from exhaustion. The wounded were abandoned. Supplies ran out. The two divisions under Nicias and Demosthenes became separated. Demosthenes' division, numbering about 6,000, was surrounded and forced to surrender after promises that lives would be spared. Nicias' larger division pushed on, desperate for water, making only about 5 miles daily under constant attack. On the 8th day, they reached the Asinalis River. The men, maddened by thirst, broke ranks and rushed to drink despite Syracusan forces holding the opposite bank. Syracusans and their Spartan allies slaughtered the Athenians as they drank, waded, or attempted to cross. Bodies piled in the river, turning the water red. Men drank blood-mixed water because they had no choice. The slaughter continued until Nicias surrendered personally to Gylippus, hoping for mercy. Even surrender didn't stop the killing immediately. Syracusans sought revenge and plunder. Perhaps 6,000 to 7,000 Athenians were captured alive from the entire expedition. The rest, tens of thousands, were dead. The prisoners faced a terrible fate. Despite Gylippus' desire to bring Nicias and Demosthenes to Sparta as trophies, the Syracusans executed both generals. Demosthenes died for his role at Pylos, where Spartans had surrendered. Nicias died partly from fear he might escape through bribery, partly from accusations of secret dealings with Syracuse. The surviving prisoners were thrown into Syracusan stone quarries, open-air pits where they died of exposure, starvation, and disease. After 70 days, Syracusans sold survivors into slavery, though some Athenians later escaped. The disaster was complete.
Thucydides concludes his account, "This was the greatest Hellenic achievement of any in this war, or, in my opinion, in Hellenic history, at once most glorious to the victors and most calamitous to the conquered. They were beaten at all points and all together. All that they suffered was great. They were destroyed, as the saying is, with a total destruction. Their fleet, their army, everything was destroyed, and few out of many returned home. The Sicilian expedition destroyed Athens' military power and broke its spirit. The finest hoplites and the best trireme crews were gone. The treasury was bankrupt. Subject states saw Athens' vulnerability and began revolting. Persia, sensing opportunity, allied with Sparta, providing gold to build a fleet that could challenge Athens at sea. Sparta fortified Decelia in 413 BCE, as Alcibiades had advised, maintaining permanent occupation of Attic territory. Athens was never again capable of offensive operations. The expedition had been entirely avoidable, a choice driven by ambition, not necessity. Its failure represented the ultimate consequence of imperial overreach and the abandonment of Periclean strategic wisdom in favor of unlimited expansion.
Book 8 is Thucydides' final book, breaking off abruptly in mid-sentence in 411 BCE, leaving 7 years of war unrecorded. This unfinished quality gives the book a unique character, raw, less polished than earlier books, with fewer speeches and more straightforward narrative. Yet it covers pivotal events: Persia's entry into the war, the oligarchic revolution at Athens, Alcibiades' Byzantine maneuvering between multiple powers, and Athens' desperate struggle for survival. The book reveals a world transformed from the one Thucydides first described: Athens' empire crumbling, democracy overthrown, former certainties dissolved into chaos and opportunism. After the Sicilian disaster, Athens' subject cities sensed opportunity. Thucydides reports that news of the catastrophe spread rapidly throughout the Greek world. States throughout the Aegean and Asia Minor began revolting from the Delian League. Chios, Miletus, Lesbos, and others threw off Athenian control. Sparta, sensing Athens' weakness, renewed the war aggressively, dispatching ships and agents throughout Ionia, encouraging rebellion. The strategic situation transformed overnight. Athens, which had dominated the Aegean for decades, now fought desperately to preserve even fragments of its empire. Most ominously, Persia entered the war.
The Persian Empire had remained largely neutral since its defeat in 479 BCE, but now King Darius II saw opportunity to reclaim the Greek cities of Asia Minor lost generations earlier. Persian satraps, particularly Tissaphernes in Lydia and Pharnabazus in Hellespontine Phrygia, began negotiating with Sparta, offering financial support to build a Spartan fleet that could challenge Athens at sea. 3 successive treaties between Sparta and Persia, recorded by Thucydides with unusual documentary precision, formalized this alliance. Persia would fund Spartan naval operations. Sparta would cede control of Ionian Greek cities to Persia. This bargain transformed the war's dynamics. Athens had always relied on naval superiority. Sparta, funded by Persian gold, could now challenge that advantage. Into this volatile situation stepped Alcibiades, whose movements through Book 8 demonstrate both his brilliance and his complete lack of principle. After advising Sparta to fortify Decelia and send Gylippus to Sicily, both devastating to Athens, Alcibiades wore out his welcome in Sparta. He had an affair with Timaya, wife of King Agis II, and fathered her son Leotychides, or so people believed. Agis, enraged, ordered Alcibiades killed. Alerted to the danger, Alcibiades fled to Tissaphernes, the Persian satrap, in 412 BCE. With the Persians, Alcibiades immediately began advising against his former Spartan allies. Thucydides reports that Alcibiades urged Tissaphernes to adopt a policy of calculated balance, support both Athens and Sparta just enough to keep them fighting each other, thus weakening both. Pay Spartan crews less, deliver funds irregularly, sow discord among Peloponnesian allies. The stronger party at any moment becomes the greater threat to Persia, therefore support whichever side is weaker. Tissaphernes, receptive to this sophisticated strategy, reduced Spartan payments and delayed promised naval support. Spartan commanders grew frustrated with Persian unreliability, unaware Alcibiades orchestrated their difficulties. But Alcibiades' real goal remained returning to Athens. Exiled, condemned to death in absentia, he needed Athens to recall him. He therefore initiated an extraordinarily cynical scheme. Through intermediaries at Samos, where Athens' fleet was stationed, Alcibiades sent messages claiming he could deliver Persian support to Athens, Tissaphernes' money, possibly even Persia's fleet, but only if Athens changed its government. Persia, he argued, distrusted democracy's instability. An oligarchy would inspire greater Persian confidence. Replace democracy with oligarchy, recall Alcibiades, and Persian gold would flow to Athens rather than Sparta. The Athenian officers at Samos, many of aristocratic background who had long resented democratic rule, found this proposal appealing. It offered solutions to Athens' desperate military situation while advancing their political preferences. Only one general, Phrynichus, saw through the scheme, arguing, Thucydides reports, that Alcibiades cared nothing for oligarchy or democracy, he merely sought any path home. The majority dismissed Phrynichus's warnings. They sent Pisander and other envoys to Athens to negotiate the constitutional revolution. At Athens, Pisander addressed the assembly with brutal honesty. Athens faced extinction. The treasury was empty, the fleet depleted, allies revolting, Persia funding Sparta. Survival required Persian support. Persian support required Alcibiades' mediation. Alcibiades' return required constitutional change, not necessarily full democracy. The choice was stark: modify the constitution or watch Athens destroyed. After heated debate, the assembly agreed to send Pisander back to negotiate with Tissaphernes and Alcibiades. These negotiations failed. Alcibiades made increasingly extravagant demands, cede control of Ionia to Persia, give up various islands, obviously designed to be unacceptable. Thucydides speculates that Alcibiades had always known Tissaphernes had no intention of abandoning Sparta for Athens. The entire scheme was manipulation, getting Athens to establish oligarchy, which might recall him, while pretending to deliver Persian aid he could never actually provide. The negotiations collapsed, but the oligarchic movement in Athens proceeded anyway, having developed its own momentum. The conspirators worked through a campaign of terror and propaganda. They assassinated democratic politicians who opposed them. They spread rumors that oligarchy was inevitable, resistance futile. They held meetings in clubs and factions, coordinating their seizure of power. In June 411 BCE, they called an assembly meeting at Colonus, outside the city walls where intimidation was easier. There, under implicit threat of violence, they dissolved democratic institutions and transferred all power to a council of 400 citizens who would govern Athens and select a larger body of 5,000, supposedly, as the ultimate sovereign. The 400, however, never selected the 5,000. They kept all power themselves, ruling as a narrow oligarchy. Thucydides' analysis of the coup is remarkable. He notes that overthrowing democracy took exceptional skill and organization. Athens had been democratic for approximately a century. Most citizens strongly supported it. The conspirators succeeded through systematic intimidation, making each citizen feel isolated and powerless. Citizens feared to speak against oligarchy lest their neighbors be conspirators. Everyone knew some opposed the coup, but no one knew who could be trusted. The conspirators' greatest weapon was spreading the belief that resistance was hopeless, the oligarchy invincible. Thucydides identifies Antiphon, the orator and sophist, as the mastermind, with Theramenus and Pisander as key leaders. He praises Antiphon's intellectual abilities, even while recording how he manipulated Athens toward oligarchy and eventual disaster. The oligarchs immediately sought peace with Sparta, sending envoys offering to end the war. They argued that Sparta had fought Athens' democracy, not Athens itself. With democracy overthrown, peace should follow. Sparta, however, rejected negotiations. Sparta's goal was destroying Athens' power, not merely its democracy. The envoys returned empty-handed. Meanwhile, Athens' fleet at Samos rejected the oligarchic coup entirely. When news reached the sailors and soldiers, they immediately reaffirmed their loyalty to democracy. Led by Thrasybulus and other democratic officers, they declared themselves the legitimate Athenian government in exile. They swore oaths to maintain democracy, hunt down oligarchs, and continue the war. They then recalled Alcibiades, not because they trusted him, but because they still believed he could deliver Persian support. Alcibiades arrived at Samos and was elected general, though shared command with others. Athens now had two governments, the oligarchic 400 controlling the city, the democratic fleet controlling Samos and Aegean operations. Civil war threatened. The 400 even sent secret envoys to Sparta offering to surrender Athens in exchange for retaining power. Some oligarchs, realizing the regime's precariousness, began maneuvering toward moderation. Theramenes emerged as leader of this moderate faction, arguing for actually establishing the 5,000, a broader oligarchy including all hoplites, approximately 5,000 men rather than just 400.
The regime collapsed rapidly. In September 411 BCE, Euboea revolted from Athens with Spartan help. Euboea's grain supply was critical. Its loss caused panic. The fleet at Samius threatened sailing to Athens to restore democracy by force. The 400 fragmented, extremists led by Antiphon and Phrynichus contemplating surrender to Sparta, moderates led by Theramenes demanding broader government. Phrynichus was assassinated in the Agora by Democrats. Facing military disaster, internal divisions, and popular rage, the 400 fell. The 5,000 were finally established, a moderate oligarchy restricting citizenship to hoplites. Thucydides unusually comments that this government was the best that the Athenians had known, at least in my time, noting it achieved a balanced mixture of oligarchy and democracy. This regime lasted until 410 BCE, when full democracy was restored. Book 8 ends with Athens in this transitional state. Oligarchy collapsed, moderate government established, fleet victorious in several small battles. The last datable event Thucydides records occurs in mid-September 411 BCE.
Then the narrative simply stops mid-sentence, breaking off during description of naval operations in the Hellespont. Scholars have debated for centuries why. Most likely, Thucydides died while still working on the history, perhaps around 400 BCE or slightly later. The text shows signs of incomplete revision, some sections polished, others rough. Certain events are mentioned that occurred after 411, including the war's end in 404, suggesting Thucydides lived to know how everything concluded, but never finished writing it.
The war's final 7 years, unrecorded by Thucydides, saw dramatic swings. Athens achieved remarkable naval victories at Cyzicus, 410 BCE, and Arginusae, 406 BCE, destroying Spartan fleets. Alcibiades returned triumphantly to Athens in 407 BCE, acclaimed as savior. But his subordinates' defeat at Nautium led to his removal from command and final exile. Sparta, under the brilliant Admiral Lysander, built a new fleet with Persian gold. At Aegospotami in 405 BCE, Lysander surprised and destroyed virtually the entire Athenian navy, perhaps 170 ships captured or destroyed, only 9 escaping. This catastrophe sealed Athens' fate. 3 forces converged on Athens. King Aegeus maintained Sparta's garrison at Decelea, King Pausanias led an army from the Peloponnese, and Lysander blockaded Piraeus with 200 ships. Cut off by land and sea, unable to import grain, Athens starved. After months of siege, with people dying daily from hunger, Athens surrendered in April 404 BCE. The terms were harsh, but not catastrophic. Corinth and Thebes demanded Athens' complete destruction, raze the city, enslave the population. Sparta refused. Remembering Athens' heroic role against Persia, the Spartans imposed more moderate terms, demolished the long walls connecting Athens to Piraeus, reduced the fleet to 12 ships, surrender all overseas possessions, become a Spartan ally. Democracy was replaced by the oligarchic government of the 30 tyrants, led by Critias, whose brutal reign terrorized Athens until democratic resistance under Thrasybulus overthrew them in 403 BCE. The war ended with Athens stripped of empire, walls, and fleet, but not destroyed. Sparta dominated Greece, but proved unable to maintain that dominance. Within a decade, Athens regained independence and rebuilt walls. The Corinthian War, 395 to 387 BCE, saw Athens, Thebes, Corinth, and Argos allied against Sparta. Greece remained divided and weakened until Macedon under Philip II conquered all the Greek city-states by 338 BCE, a catastrophe Thucydides did not live to see, but which his work anticipated. Book 8's incompleteness lends it unique poignancy. We see Thucydides working in real time, less distance between events and narrative, showing us his historical method's raw mechanics. The abundance of documents and treaties, the detailed chronology, the careful diplomatic negotiations, all reveal Thucydides as archivist and analyst. The relative absence of speeches, though some remain, suggests he planned adding more but never completed revisions. The book stands as monument to history's contingency, not just the events it describes, but its own existence, cut short by death or circumstance, leaving us to wonder what insights Thucydides would have offered about Athens' final agony had he lived to write them. Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War stands as one of the most influential texts in Western intellectual history. For over 2,000 years, it has shaped how we think about war, power, democracy, human nature, and the dynamics between states. Its influence extends far beyond ancient history into political science, international relations theory, military strategy, and contemporary policy debates. Understanding Thucydides' legacy requires examining both what he actually wrote and how successive generations have interpreted, reinterpreted, and sometimes misinterpreted his work. Thucydides pioneered what we might call scientific history, history as rigorous investigation of causes and effects rather than mythological narrative or moral fable.
He explicitly rejected the supernatural explanations that pervaded earlier Greek historiography. Where Herodotus attributed events to divine intervention and fate, Thucydides sought human motivations, rational calculations, and structural forces. He distinguished between immediate causes, the specific incidents triggering war, and deeper causes, the underlying power dynamics making conflict likely. This analytical framework, separating surface events from fundamental drivers, became foundational to later historical and political thinking.
His methodology set standards that remain relevant. He emphasized eyewitness testimony, cross-checked sources, acknowledged uncertainty, and attempted objectivity despite personal involvement. He recognized his own potential biases as exiled Athenian general while striving to transcend them. The speeches in his history, whether representing what was actually said or what Thucydides thought should have been said, functioned as analytical tools, presenting competing arguments about policy and allowing readers to weigh different perspectives. This dialectical approach to political questions influenced everyone from ancient historians to modern political theorists. Most importantly, Thucydides presented his work as a possession for all time, not merely chronicle of past events, but analysis of permanent patterns in human behavior and political life. He believed human nature remains essentially constant, therefore similar circumstances produce similar dynamics regardless of era. This universalist claim that we can learn from the Peloponnesian War because fundamental features of power, fear, and ambition don't change made Thucydides perpetually relevant. It also made him perpetually controversial. The most influential aspect of Thucydides' legacy has been his association with political realism, the view that international politics operates according to power rather than justice, that states pursue self-interest, that moral considerations have little force in relations between nations. The Melian dialogue, where Athenian envoys declare, "The strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must," has become realism's most quoted statement. Thucydides' analysis of the war's outbreak, what made war inevitable was the growth of Athenian power and the fear which this caused in Sparta, provided realism's foundational insight about security dilemmas and power transitions.
Yet calling Thucydides simply a realist oversimplifies his complex position. While he certainly describes a world where power matters enormously, he doesn't endorse this as desirable. His treatment of Athens' imperial trajectory suggests critique, not celebration, of unchecked power. The Sicilian disaster follows directly from Athens abandoning Periclean restraint for unlimited ambition. The Melian dialogue precedes Sicily. The immediate juxtaposition suggests that Athens' brutal realpolitik toward Melos presages its own catastrophe. Thucydides shows repeatedly that pure power calculations divorced from justice and moderation lead to overreach and ruin. The Corcyra stasis analysis reveals Thucydides' view that war corrupts not just interstate relations, but internal society. Language itself becomes perverted when violence dominates. The oligarchic coup demonstrates how military pressure enables anti-democratic forces. Throughout, Thucydides presents war as teacher of violence, polemos biaios didaskalos, a force that brings human nature down to the level of brutal circumstances, stripping away civilized constraints. This hardly sounds like endorsement of realpolitik. Better perhaps to say Thucydides was a tragic realist, someone who saw clearly how power, fear, and ambition drive politics, who had no illusions about human nature's darker aspects, but who mourned rather than celebrated these realities. He understood that states cannot act purely on justice. Survival requires attending to power. Yet he showed that states acting purely on power destroy themselves. The tension between these positions, realism's insights and its limitations, runs throughout the history.
Thucydides' influence on Western political thought cannot be overstated. Thomas Hobbes translated the history in 1629, finding in it confirmation of his views about human nature, anarchy, and the necessity of sovereign power. Hobbes' Leviathan draws heavily on Thucydidean insights about fear, security, and the state of nature. Niccolò Machiavelli, though writing before modern Thucydides translations were widely available, developed similar realist frameworks analyzing power politics in The Prince and Discourses. In the 20th century, Thucydides became central to international relations theory. Classical realists like Hans Morgenthau and E.H. Carr drew explicitly on Thucydides to develop their analyses of interstate behavior. Morgenthau's Politics Among Nations, 1948, cited Thucydides extensively, particularly the Melian dialogue, as evidence that power, not morality, governs relations between states. Kenneth Waltz's neo-realism, or structural realism, emphasized how the anarchic international system, lacking overarching authority, creates security dilemmas similar to those Thucydides described between Athens and Sparta. During the Cold War, American policymakers and strategists studied Thucydides intensely. The bipolar confrontation between superpowers seemed to mirror the Athenian-Spartan rivalry. The Melian dialogue was read as justifying interventions to maintain spheres of influence. Thucydides' analysis of alliances, deterrence, and strategic miscalculation informed thinking about nuclear strategy. The parallel seemed obvious. Two great powers, ideologically opposed, democracy versus oligarchy, capitalism versus communism, locked in global competition where neither could afford to appear weak.
Critics, however, noted dangers in this appropriation. Thucydides described war's horrors, not its glory, using him to justify Cold War interventions in places like Vietnam, Guatemala, or Iran, supporting brutal dictatorships in the name of containing communism, twisted his insights into ideology. Thucydides showed how fear of losing power leads to moral compromise and eventual disaster. Invoking him to rationalize such compromises misread the text fundamentally. The history is a warning, not instruction manual for empire. The most prominent contemporary invocation of Thucydides is the concept of Thucydides' trap, coined by Harvard political scientist Graham Allison around 2011 and developed fully in his 2017 book Destined for War: Can America and China Escape Thucydides' Trap? Allison drew directly from Thucydides' statement that what made war inevitable was the growth of Athenian power and the fear which this caused in Sparta. He used this to describe a structural pattern whereby rising powers challenge established powers, creating dangerous dynamics that often lead to war. Allison's research team identified 16 cases over the past 500 years where a rising power threatened to displace a ruling one. War broke out in 12 of these cases. The pattern seemed clear. Rapid power transitions create security dilemmas, misperceptions, and strategic anxieties that make war probable even when neither side wants it. Applied to U.S.-China relations, the Thucydides trap framework suggests heightened war risk as China's economic and military rise challenges American global predominance.
The concept has proven enormously influential. Chinese President Xi Jinping referenced it in speeches. American policymakers debate it. Military strategists study it. The term entered the international relations lexicon, appearing in countless articles, speeches, and policy papers analyzing U.S.-China tensions. Allison's book became, in the words of BBC diplomatic correspondent Jonathan Marcus, required reading for many policymakers, academics, and journalists. Yet the Thucydides trap concept has also generated substantial criticism. Scholars like Yale historian Donald Kagan, author of the definitive 4-volume history of the Peloponnesian War, and Harvard classicist Ernst Badian argued that Allison misreads Thucydides. The Peloponnesian War, Kagan contends, wasn't caused by Athens' rise challenging Sparta. Athens had risen decades earlier. Rather, it was Athens' perceived decline that made Sparta think war was worth the risk. Athenian policy mistakes, not structural power transition, enabled conflict. Joseph Nye pointed to this research, arguing that the war resulted from contingent choices, not inevitable structural forces. Sparta chose war because it perceived Athenian weakness and miscalculated its ability to win quickly. Different Spartan decisions could have avoided war. This undermines Allison's deterministic framing that power transitions make war inevitable. Foreign policy scholars Hal Brands and Michael Beckley developed an alternative peaking power framework, arguing that states are most dangerous not when rising, but when they peak and face imminent decline, matching neither Thucydides nor the U.S.-China situation. Methodological critiques have been equally sharp. Allison's 16 case studies have been questioned for unclear definitions of a rising and ruling power, arbitrary historical boundaries, and selection bias. What counts as a power transition? Why include some cases but not others? The sample is too small for statistical confidence, and the cases too dissimilar for meaningful comparison. Lawrence Friedman argued the Thucydides trap is an unhelpful construct that tells us very little of value because contexts differ so dramatically across centuries. Some scholars note the framework's cultural limitations. It applies Western and ancient Greek analogies to fundamentally different Chinese strategic culture and historical experience. David Dalkai Lee argues China's rise differs fundamentally from cases like Imperial Germany. Moreover, Chinese state media has instrumentalized the Thucydides trap narrative, using it to argue that China's regional dominance is natural and inevitable, that the U.S. should accept Chinese primacy in Asia just as Britain accepted American dominance in the Western Hemisphere. Despite these criticisms, the broader point stands. Thucydides remains remarkably relevant to contemporary international relations. Whether or not power transitions make war inevitable, they clearly create dangerous dynamics. Fear, honor, and interest, the three motivations Thucydides identified driving states, still operate. Security dilemmas where defensive measures by one side appear threatening to others still generate arms races and crises. Alliances still entangle great powers in conflicts they didn't initially seek. Miscalculation, misperception, and overconfidence still lead states into catastrophic wars. What makes Thucydides enduringly valuable isn't predictions about specific outcomes, but his framework for analyzing political dynamics. He teaches us to distinguish immediate causes from structural ones. He shows how domestic politics and external strategy interact, how Athens democracy shaped its foreign policy, and how war pressures transformed democratic institutions. He demonstrates that power without wisdom leads to disaster, that moral considerations can't be ignored without cost, that human nature under stress produces predictable patterns of behavior. The history also warns against hubris, the arrogant certainty that we are exceptional, that rules applying to others don't apply to us, that our power makes us invulnerable. Athens entered Sicily supremely confident. The expedition was glorious spectacle, the fleet magnificent, the ambition unlimited. 2 years later, the army was annihilated, the fleet destroyed, tens of thousands dead or enslaved. Thucydides presents this as tragedy, not random misfortune, but predictable consequence of overreach. Leaders who think themselves beyond constraint, states that abandon moderation for unlimited ambition, empires that mistake temporary dominance for permanent superiority, all face reckoning. For students of international relations, Thucydides offers no simple lessons. He doesn't tell us whether realism or idealism better describes the world, whether power or justice should guide policy, whether war is inevitable or avoidable. Instead, he presents complexity, showing how structural forces constrain choices while human decisions still matter, how fear can be both rational and destructive, how power enables achievement but also corrupts judgment. For students of democracy, Thucydides provides both inspiration and warning.
Pericles' funeral oration articulates democratic ideals beautifully: equality before law, merit not birth determining worth, openness and freedom as sources of strength. Yet the plague demonstrates democracy's vulnerability to catastrophe. The Mytilenean debate shows democratic decision-making at its best: careful deliberation, moral argument, narrow choice for restraint. The oligarchic coup shows democracy's fragility under military pressure. Sicily shows how democratic assemblies can make catastrophic choices when demagogues replace statesmen. Ultimately, Thucydides matters because he illuminates permanent tensions in political life between power and justice, fear and trust, short-term advantage and long-term stability, moral principle and strategic necessity. He doesn't resolve these tensions, but shows their consequences play out in history. States must attend to power, survival depends on it, but cannot ignore justice, legitimacy requires it. Leaders must calculate interests, strategy demands it, but also consider honor, credibility needs it. Democracies must make decisions collectively, freedom requires it, but maintain strategic coherence. Effectiveness demands it.
Reading Thucydides today, whether in Washington or Beijing, Brussels or Delhi, means engaging these enduring questions. It means recognizing that while technologies change, while specific circumstances differ, fundamental dynamics of power, fear, and ambition remain. It means understanding that history doesn't repeat exactly, but patterns recur. Most importantly, it means accepting that knowledge of these patterns doesn't guarantee avoiding tragedy, but ignorance of them virtually guarantees it. That is why Thucydides' history remains, as he intended, a possession for all time. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War. We've traced the arc of a conflict that destroyed the Greek world's greatest powers, from the idealism of Pericles' funeral oration to the pragmatism of the Mytilenean debate, from the moral collapse at Corcyra to the brutal calculus of the Melian dialogue, and finally to the catastrophic hubris of the Sicilian expedition. Thucydides wrote not just to record what happened, but to explain why, to reveal the timeless patterns of human nature, power, and fear that drive nations toward conflict. His work remains urgently relevant today. As we navigate tensions between great powers, grapple with democracy under pressure, and confront the gap between our ideals and our actions, Thucydides reminds us that these challenges are not new. The names and technologies change, but the fundamental dynamics endure. That's what makes his history truly a possession for all time. If you enjoyed this deep dive into ancient philosophy and history, please like, subscribe, and share this video. Leave a comment letting me know which aspect of Thucydides' work resonated most with you, or which classical text you'd like me to explore next. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and remember, the lessons of the past illuminate the path forward.